January 1925, 1 year after Lenin's January 1924 death, Trotsky was removed as war commissar, resigning, where he had been outvoted 4-1 anyway since 1918. The removal had been predictable after the new army leadership was formalized at this Congress, but the fact was Trotsky had lost out as the sole decision-maker in March 1921. And even before that, in November 1918, Trotsky had lost out as sole military commander. Then Stalin and Lenin, as well as himself, were each made one of the three principal military leaders of the Soviet Republic declared to be a military camp. At any rate, in 1921 the victorious Leninists had brought Frunze in as the de facto new army chief of staff, with Voroshilov his adjutant. Now, under Stalin's 1925 leadership, Frunze and Voroshilov's roles were official. Trotsky was completely out of military affairs and no longer war commissar. Frunze was the new war commissar and Voroshilov his chief commander and vice commissar. Trotsky's Politburo exit October 1926. After his January 1925 military affairs demotion, Trotsky refused other assignments and sulked. Accordingly, under the no-nonsense Stalinist regime, Trotsky's many Politburo enemies demanded Trotsky's ouster from the Politburo on disciplinary grounds. This finally happened at the October 1926 15 Party Conference. In October 1926, Stalin supported the ouster of Trotsky from the Politburo while opposing simultaneously Zinoviev and Kamenev's motion that Trotsky be expelled from the party altogether. There would be no Lenin for protection now. Only Stalin's intervention had saved Trotsky's ass from expulsion at this point. Thus, in 1926, Trotsky lost his position in the highest leadership of the party. And he was out of the political decision-making, where after all he had alienated almost all the Politburo members, and had at the end of the conference barely held on to his party membership. The hatred the party had for Trotsky on the eve of the Kronstadt rebellion, where it had been set aside momentarily, Chapter 10, now came back to roost. Again, only by the skin of his teeth, had Trotsky escaped expulsion from the party altogether. And that, ironically, only because of Stalin's intervention. Trotsky out October 1927. In October 1927, Trotsky's reprieve failed to save him when he refused to change his ways and Trotsky was expelled from the Central Committee for Factionalism. This date marks the official end of him as a leader of the CPSU. Trotsky gone January 1928 and November 1927. At the XVTH Congress, Trotsky was finally expelled from the party altogether. The Politburo and the Central Committee ordered Trotsky to cease and desist in the organization of subversive activities and demonstrations, and they ordered Trotsky exiled to Soviet Turkestan. Trotsky begins his long journey in exile February 1929. Finally, unsatisfied that Trotsky would cease and desist while on Soviet soil, the Politburo and the Central Committee ordered him expelled from the Soviet Union in 1929. He was taken to a resort island named Bayukuta, Big Island, largest of the 9 Princess Islands, then called Principe Island, near Istanbul, and handed $1,500 US in severance by the head of his Chaika escort. Bayukuta is 2 square miles in territory and Trotsky spent 4 years there, 1929 to 1933. Trotsky disgraces himself in Mexico. January 1937 to August 1940. After several years at Principe Island, Trotsky lived and traveled through Europe. He finally took refuge in Mexico City in 1937 as the guest of Mexican President Lázaro Cárdenas and former Mexican communist, the muralist, now Trotskyist, Diego Rivera, at the latter's home. Trotsky would spend nearly 4 years in this Mexico City suburb, the last 4 years of his life. In the home of his host, he had a sexual affair with Frida Kahlo, Rivera's wife, and subsequently was forced by his own misbehavior into a far less secure Coyoacán, Mexico City, home, owned by Ms. Kahlo. When President Cardenas learned of the real reason for the Rivera-Trotsky falling out, he was disgusted and removed his force of bodyguards, leaving Trotsky to handle his own security using Minneapolis Teamsters, who proved inadequate. On August 20, 1940, at this home of Frida Kahlo in Coyoacán, Trotsky was eventually assassinated, attacked with an ice pick to the skull. He died the next day, killed by one of Stalin's finest, Ramon Mercader. This business with Ms. Kahlo and the Trotsky assassination is pursued in more depth below in Chapter 13. See the Salma Hayek-produced movie Frida. The party never liked Trotsky and did not want him in the summer of 1917. Lenin wanted him then, despite their many years of mutual antipathy, and in a leadership position, for his own reasons, which we reviewed in Chapter 10 and again in Chapter 11. In early 1918, Lenin moved Trotsky from the Foreign Office to being chief of the War Commissariat. Why? Because Lenin appreciated Trotsky's no-nonsense, absolute discipline, take charge and get it done attitude. As always, I defer to Lenin's judgment in this matter, but it is also true that Trotsky, in the opinion of many of his contemporaries, did not do well at all in the Civil War. There was constant conflict between Trotsky and Stalin over every aspect of military operations, and this continued throughout 1918. In April 1919, Stalin and Dzerzhinsky were able to replace Trotsky's chief of staff, with Frunze, who took Vatsidis's place, and 3 of the remaining 4 seats went to Stalinists. So, in the 5-man party war committee, this left Trotsky as war commissar and 4 Stalinists. Trotsky's advocacy of using former Tsarist officers in huge numbers. Trotsky recruited well over 75,000 of them, as this would be a 5.5 million man army, and Trotsky felt he had no choice. But it was one of the major reasons for his being disliked by the old Bolsheviks and the new working-class officers during the Civil War. Also, the Stalinists did not believe the political officer equivalence for each Tsarist officer was sufficient until Felix Dzerzhinsky, head of the Cheka, began the wholesale introduction of Chekists as political officers. Another, more justifiable criticism was about Trotsky's arrogant, ruling class, personal behavior, especially toward the working-class officers of the Red Army. Something Trotsky tends to admit in his autobiography My Life. When Lenin's protection was withdrawn by death, it was only a matter of time until Trotsky disappeared from the scene. As I say, if it hadn't been Stalin who confronted him, it would have been someone else, and I am rather sure the result would have been the same for the reasons we have discussed in this book. War communism. Who or whom? Lenin had posed the question specifically, and that way. The subject? Whether socialist or bourgeois power would prevail within the Soviet Republic in the end. The worker or the capitalist? Everyone knew eventually that the party would have to confront and resolve the agricultural situation in its way. Alternatively, give way to a bourgeoisified semi-feudal agrarian regime antithetical to its socialist goals. If that were to happen, Russia and its confederated republics might look something like A.H.G. Wells' futuristic welfare state. This was not what the Bolshevik leaders wanted, even if some were willing to live with it indefinitely. It was certainly not what Stalin and his closest comrades wanted. The 1917 redistribution of land had been largely spontaneous as farmers rose and seized the landed estates of the feudal lords and the privately owned capitalist farms of the city magnates. Although the Bolsheviks had advocated land to the farmers unconditionally, what that meant, now in practice in 1917 in the October Soviet Republic, depended upon who was talking. Socialist Revolutionary (SR) party members, by far the largest of the farmer parties, knew what they thought that meant. According to them, there would be a return to the village collective with everyone assured of equal access to good land and a large portion set aside for the collective good. SRs left and right divided along the lines of who was the most egalitarian, so that left SRs tended to side with Bolsheviks more often than their own party members. The Bolsheviks wanted collective farms and cooperatives with all the land the property of the nation, leased to these new entities. The Mensheviks would have been happy with a simple free market. Second economy in the countryside leading wherever it was to lead. Outside the Soviet government and left milieu, the cadets wanted compensation for the seized landowners and perhaps restoration wherever possible. The debate ended as the Bolsheviks suppressed internal counter-revolution simultaneously with the 1918 to 1919 defeat of the main white forces and foreign invaders. By January 1920, what were left were the farming masses with whatever land in their hands they had been able to grab for themselves, and a central government in Moscow willing to accept that as long as the farming families surrendered grain, meat, poultry, and other goods and services, as demanded by the government. A government embattled at home and surrounded by enemies, which had to feed the working class, the cities, and most especially the army. This policy, combined with the issuing of specie IOUs, was what the Bolsheviks had come to call war communism. New economic policy NEP Lenin's spring 1921, repeal of war communism and the reintroduction of capitalist market economics in the countryside had worked out all right. At least it had not empowered the enemies of socialism in any dramatic way. That was because as yet there was no new wealthy dominating rich farmer class. It would take several years for well-to-do strata farmers to separate from middle and lower strata farmers and, of course, from landless agricultural workers. The latter being those who had lost out altogether in the free-for-all, grab-bag affair that had been redistribution in 1917. The government, for all of its desire to help, had been pitifully unable to do so. The countryside had rebuilt according to its own history and traditions and at-hand possibilities. Of course, human and animal-pulled wooden plough-prepared fields did not require great technological input anyway. Inside Snapshot August 1926 Sorg, read in. Mechanization of Agriculture. Richard, I want to show you something. Thank you, Comrade Stalin. We are stepping up production of our own tractors from our own tractor factories. That's wonderful. Yes, it is. You see here, we are getting an entire Ford tractor assembly line as well as the subcontracting sources, again building our own factories, to support it. Yes, sir. With this one plant alone, we will be able to produce about 600 tractors a month to begin with and more as time proceeds. That will double our tractor production per month by the time it is fully online. Yes, sir. Do you know how many we need? I have no idea, sir. We need to support on the American scale our needs. Keep in mind we have the working people to put into these factories because the American system allows a multitude of jobs to be created along a broad spectrum of tasks to be performed in production. In short, I need a minimum of 20,000 tractors a year for 5 years. Really, we will need twice that to supply the entire countryside when it is collectivized. This would just barely keep us up to where we need to be in agriculture. That is not enough. The truth is I need 100 times that much. I see. But the countryside is barely collectivized. That is about to change. Anyway, do you know what this particular factory costs us? No, sir. Again, I have no idea. I paid $10,100,000 for this first factory plus an ongoing contract for that much every year ad infinitum and probably more. Paid in cash. The capitalist banks won't advance sufficient credit to buy more. So to produce 100,000 tractors annually we would have to import or build 20 big factories like this one and pay in cash. Exactly. You're quick, Richard. That's why I spend so much time with you. Of course, it's enjoyable for me to socialize with a person more of my type in terms of life experience. Especially someone of your real-world experience who understands what I am talking about first time around. Do you know what our foreign reserves look like? No, sir. Good, you shouldn't know. The truth is we have less than $100 million in our banks today. All of it is committed. Where am I going to get $200 million for Ford? Jesus Christ! I don't know. Exactly. It's all I can do to pay for this one factory right now. We cannot industrialize without money. We don't have the money, and furthermore we won't be getting it from the blood-sucking international bankers. As you may have read, the British banks have just notified us that they are cancelling our line of credit. And they are calling in their existing loans, meaning I have to pay them off now in cash. This despite the fact that I have maintained our payments exactly as required and have the best credit rating in the world among capitalist bankers, accepting only the USA government's credit rating. So what do we do? Exactly. What is to be done? Thank you for informing me, sir. But what is it that I may be able to do to help? I know what has to be done, don't worry about that. What I want from you is simply your understanding of our current crisis and the importance of you doing exactly as I tell you to do. In other words, that my instructions are performed exactly as I say in the coming years. You do your part and I'll do mine. You can count on me, sir. I am your man, unto death do us part. Thank you. That's all for today, Richard. Assignment Europe, December 1926. The boss was speaking to the graduating interns from the Comintern's Intelligence Division, a division of the Chika, at year's end 1926. He was winding up what had been a lengthy question and answer period. It's time for each of you to gain some essential international field experience with our parties. Yes, our parties. As you have surmised, the difficulties we have had in the Soviet Union are reflected directly in the thinking of our foreign comrades. This is not a good thing. They should be worrying about developing strategies for seizing state power in their own countries, not worrying about what we are doing here to combat our terrible economic backwardness. They have the industry we need, and the best contribution they can make is to get that industry into our collective hands via revolution at home. For a variety of reasons, this logic is not going to be universally accepted in our parties. Another, and not the least reason the foreigners are again looking to us, is to provide them with the model of what they are supposed to do. But in practice, all our highfalutin pronouncements of October over the radio aside, our model has developed in stages and continues to do so. They will always be playing catch-up if they insist on duplicating what we did. Systematically, the idea is to duplicate socialism as a system at the level comfortable for the nation involved. That will be far different in Berlin than in Ulaanbaatar, red flag in English, the capital of the People's Republic of Mongolia ed. At any rate, as I say, for a variety of reasons, these factional disputes will continue to arise in these parties, and we have to be prepared to surgically excise the troublemakers. It is after all the primary justification for our organizational division to exist, that is, to see that the policy of the International Party is laid down and adhered to in the Leninist spirit of democratic centralism. To that end, the organizational division is now going to need help from the intelligence division. Accordingly, each of you will spend the next 2 critical years in the field, in Europe west of our frontiers, ostensibly as organizational division cadre. Some of you have already begun. This is more than a training exercise. I am going to have to ask you young men and women to grow up a little early. You see, our country and our class are under attack. Of course, we have always been under attack since October 1917. All we have had are periods of respite when we can catch our breath and get ready for the next round. Right now, the capitalists of all the advanced capitalist countries, Germany, France, Italy, Britain, the USA, and Japan, not to mention their empires and allies, are trying to reach an accord to go to World War once again. They will be against us, united amongst themselves. This we must prevent at all costs. It was Comrade Lenin's doctrine of keeping the capitalist encirclement divided, formalized at Rapallo in the spring of 1922, which has kept us safe so far. It is the foundation for our current policies. Although you should be aware, the shape of those policies may shift radically. What do I mean by that? We have to prevent by any means necessary any block between Germany and the rest of Europe. Such a block would inevitably be directed against us, as I am sure you know. We also have to keep the US and Japan from allying against us in the Far East as they began to do during the Civil War. At all costs, in other words, we have to prevent capitalist unity against us and encourage worldwide anti-capitalist unity of workers and farmers. Thus, from time to time you may be called upon to perform dangerous missions. Finally, as agents of the organizational division, you will be checking the background on each member of these foreign parties, particularly leading members. Remember, always provide a summary of that person's political involvement, if any, with the current arguments in the international communist press about ongoing developments in the Soviet Union. You will each be instructed in the day-to-day activities of organizational division agents, and we expect to see you on your first assignments in Western Europe in January of next year, which is about 2 weeks away. So we will not be seeing each other again until each of you returns, at which time I want to meet with each of you for a personal debriefing. Comrade Stalin left the podium and the students stood at attention. The graduation over. 5 years of finding our way. Red Army in the Soviet Military-Industrial Complex 1924 to 1929. Following the death of Vladimir Lenin, at the end of January 21, 1924, the Soviet government faced a series of crises. Not the least of these was how to prepare the country to defend itself against the imperialist encirclement. In the 17 years that followed Lenin's passing, the Red Army grew to be the best modern army in the world. It had the most sophisticated civilian support formation, and associated industrial plant and mechanized agricultural infrastructure the world had ever seen. In this section we will review in more detailed historical context the phases through which the Red Army, and the supporting military-industrial complex, MIC, evolved in the 5 years between Lenin's passing and the beginning of Stalin's Great Turn in August of 1928. Accordingly, we shall summarize 1. The most important phases in that evolution, February 1, 1924 through August 1, 1928, and 2. The critical budgetary issues confronting the Soviet government at each step along the way. Red Army Readiness 1924. For the moment we Reds had peace on our frontiers, but we were well aware that, as Lenin had warned, this was a temporary situation and we had to get ready for the next round. The Red Army itself was huge but not modern. Yet, its sheer size, 600,000 in January 1924, meant that it was ready and capable of defeating any imperialist single aggressor or alliance of client states, Poland, Romania and Bulgaria, that year. But what about succeeding years? The army was expensive and the budgetary future appeared bleak. For example, troop levels and equipment modernization would have to be modest indeed given the financial constraints. The Party Politburo approved a government 1923 to 1924 fiscal year * defense budget of 329.2 mr, R equals rubles in this text, M equals million, B equals billion. Of this defense budget the Red Army got 2/3 or 248.2 mr, the Red Navy 30 mr and War Industry 90 mr. This meant an additional appropriation of 20 mr would have to be made and the financial resources identified. That was not nearly enough to do much more than barely pay, feed, clothe, and house the soldiers and sailors. Even so, it was also expected to cover what pathetic war industry existed and expand it somewhat. The fiscal year. In 1922 the Party Central Committee determined the fiscal year, financial planning year, for the Soviet Republic, and in 1924, Soviet Union, to be October 1 through September 30. Red Army doctrine beginning in 1925. Trotsky was allowed to resign in January of 1925. Stalin's close friend and longtime intimate collaborator, Red Army Chief of Staff Mikhail Frunze *, took over as War Commissar. He backed up his new position theoretically by writing the introduction, Front and Rear in Future War, to what was to become the basic text of Red Army military doctrine. That book, entitled General Foundations of the Mobilization of Industry for the Needs of War by P. Karategin. Frunze. Another set in concrete lie of Leon Trotsky was that Stalin assassinated Frunze to put Voroshilov in charge. Trotsky's friendly biographer Isaac Deutscher calls these writers vulgar Trotskyists. They repeat this lie even to this day, although there is not a shred of proof that such a thing happened or even that it could have happened. This lie flies in the face of all historical evidence about Stalin and Frunze as close collaborators and friends. Frunze was not only an intellectual Marxist and a revolutionary man of action, he was also quite competent as a theoretician. In science, the word theory does not mean hypothesis. In science, the word theory means the highest explanatory construct in that science, and we call it the general theory of that science. A subset of the subject matter of that science we call specific theory. In this case, Frunze was able to take our general theory, the theory of historical materialism, and create a Marxist and Leninist specific theory of war. How to prepare for war, and then how to conduct it. Thus, the title of his introduction, Front and Rear in Future War. His principal point, and that of the Karategin textbook General Foundations for which he wrote the Front and Rear introduction, was that the proletarian state * was a new kind of state. One where the proletariat now stood at the head of society, and could lead in a non-antagonistic way. In so doing, it ensured conformity of the mass of the civilian population, most of who were farmers in Russia in 1925. They would unite and fulfill the needs of the proletarian state apparatus, in this case specifically the Red Army and Navy. Definitions of terms * the state. I want you to always remember that the word state, in Marxist terms, means the military and the police as an entity distinct from government and nation. In this political sense, the term nation includes all the human and natural resources within specific political boundaries **. Government refers to the administrative apparatus that runs all those daily and long-term operations of national maintenance and expansion as directed by the party. The state and government and the nation, in applied communism, as in the Soviet Republic and later the Soviet Union, features the state, the government, and the nation under the command of the Communist Party. This is Leninism in practice once we seize state power. This might be a good time for you to go back to the initial glossary in this handbook and restudy our definitions of terms. Marxism and the National Question was the title of Stalin's first major theoretical work, which he undertook literally as a pupil of Lenin who oversaw the project. Stalin was living with Lenin and Krupskaya when he wrote this major paper. It was published in 3 parts in March, April, and May of 1913, and pursues the subject of what a nation is and how the Bolshevik Party should relate to the needs of the many nationalities in the Tsarist Empire. His presentation then is a far more sophisticated discussion of the concept of nation than I have just implied in my use of the term here. In my strictly limited usage, the term nation means what is encompassed by national frontiers. This treatise on Marxism and the national question was the reason Lenin gave Stalin the portfolio of Commissar for Nationalities in October 1917. The fact that Stalin was Georgian rather than Great Russian had symbolic significance as well. You can get the entire document at Marxist's Internet Archive. Back at the ranch. Frunze died Halloween Day of 1925, October 31st, and a week later, November 6, 1925, Klim Voroshilov was appointed his successor as head of the Commissariat for War, becoming the third war commissar in Soviet history. In June 1934, the party changed the War Commissariat's name to Defense Commissariat, a position he retained for 15 years, until May 7, 1940, when General Semyon Timoshenko succeeded him. This change in personalities did little to affect the substance of the crisis confronting the Red Army and consuming most of its high-level debate, which was literally that it had no money. Training was cheap, and reorganization on paper, and in the barrack square cheaper still. As such, moving units around on paper and in the field was a stopgap. A then Second World sort of military substitute for rearming with modern weaponry. And this was about all that the government could do for the Red Army. At least, we had the new General Foundations textbook that put forward a new fundamental military doctrine. Namely, that for a cash-strapped and backward economy cursed proletarian state, the essence of the matter was to gear the army and navy to the civilian population, and to its industrial and agricultural sectors. Meaning that the civilian parts of the economy took the satisfaction of military needs as their first objective. The Karategin and Frunze textbook said this meant that there had to be a 1. Core of permanent military industries and 2. That the rest of the industrial infrastructure had to be built in such a way that it could be immediately converted to military production when war came. 3. And war was inevitable. It was only a matter of time and who would move first. 4. The entire civilian population had likewise to be prepared to be militarized when that war came. Thus, General Foundations is the first document you may wish to read as you study the formation of the People's War strategy and the Neo-Napoleonic battle plan of 1941. We shall discuss this strategy and this plan in depth in Chapter 13. No money. Flashback. Gregory Sokolnikov and Finance Commissariat. On the second day of the Bolshevik Revolution, November 8, New Style, the Sovnarkom, Council of People's Commissars or Council of Ministers to Outsiders, Chairman, Prime Minister V.I. Lenin ordered the creation of the People's Commissariat of Finance. He appointed Ivan Skvortsov-Stepanov as the People's Commissar for Finance Narkomfin. Narkomfin had its chief commissar as a member of the Sovnarkom. Within 3 days he was replaced, Skvortsov-Stepanov reassigned, by future Cheka chief Vyacheslav Menzinsky, who, later succeeding Felix Dzerzhinsky in 1926. He was also reassigned 5 months later and replaced in turn by Isidor Gakovsky, who also lasted 5 months before reassignment. Nikolai Krestinsky, who we have mentioned before, Chapter 10 under How the Bolshevik Payroll Worked, became the next Commissar of Finance, and was also a member of the Sovnarkom, Council of Ministers. Lenin had a large cadre of extremely capable old Bolsheviks, but given the demands of the day he had to move them around like pieces on a chessboard in order to get maximum advantage. On November 26, 1921, Gregory Sokolnikov replaced Krestinsky, nearly 6 months before Lenin's first stroke. Flashback: Lenin sends Sokolnikov. Given his success with Germany in securing gold marks and cleaning up Trotsky's mess before the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Lenin sent Sokolnikov to clean up financial affairs. Trotsky had totally failed in his negotiations with the Germans in early 1918 and did not get what Lenin wanted. What Lenin wanted was an immediate peace with Germany regardless of the sacrifice of imperial territory required to get it. Trotsky had preferred to cater to both wings of the Bolshevik Party Politburo, the pro-war wing and the anti-war wing *, and presented the Germans with a "no war, no peace" proclamation which they would not tolerate. Accordingly, the Wehrmacht went on to the offensive immediately, and virtually unopposed Germany seized everything they wanted. Lenin then sent Gregory Sokolnikov to sign the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, now the city of Brest in Belarus, which he did on March 3, 1918, just in time, this is to say just before the Germans pushed into Petrograd. This treaty gave the Bolsheviks peace and secured their limited grip on state power in Russia. In exchange, Lenin gave them everything they wanted. One group of Politburo members wanted to fight a revolutionary war, taking the position that the international working class would see Lenin's peace at any price as a sellout to German autocracy. The other wing supported Lenin, saying that the most important thing was for the Bolshevik Party was to retain state power. With the Germans at the gate, this was an issue very much in doubt, as Germany would undoubtedly go on the offensive once again. The Reds had no army of their own at this point, and the Tsarist army had been reduced to some 300,000 men, and all of them were unwilling to continue the fight. Trotsky, in my opinion, took the position of "no war, no peace" to placate both wings of the Politburo, rather than alienate one of them, which might prevent him from becoming Lenin's successor down the road. At any rate, Sokolnikov had already gained experience in dealing with the ruble and the state bank and in attempting to bring some kind of order into Soviet finances. One of the ways he had done that was to get Germany to keep shipping cash to the Leninist government in Petrograd. You cannot fight a war without pay for your soldiers and the ability to pay for food and clothing for them. All armies in the last analysis travel on their stomachs, regardless of ideology, because they are made up of men who must eat. Lenin had to have a steady flow of real gold cash, gold marks, to back up the script, and the new rubles the government was issuing to do these two things, feed and clothe the army. Sokolnikov had had that task. The Germans knew him and listened to his plea for peace. They agreed and gave Lenin the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. On November 26, 1921, Vladimir Lenin ordered the reorganization of the People's Commissariat for Finance and appointed Gregory Sokolnikov as chief commissar. In practice, this became the Central Budget Office, National Treasury and Central Bank. A year later, the Rykov government * ratified the appointment, making it permanent. Sokolnikov would serve as commissar in charge of the Finance Commissariat until January 16, 1926. In 1922, after Lenin's first stroke, Alexei Rykov had become the acting chair of the Sovnarkom, Council of Ministers, that is, the new prime minister. In other words, Rykov replaced Lenin as head of government, premier or prime minister, after Lenin's removal from political life by his stroke and slow recovery. The names of both the Sovnarkom and its commissars changed in 1946 when the Sovnarkom officially became the Council of Ministers and the Finance Commissariat became the Ministry of Finance. One of Sokolnikov's first tasks was to stabilize a national currency, i.e. stabilize the ruble. Experts on Soviet history that I respect agree that Sokolnikov did a fantastic job at producing the first stable Soviet ruble and introducing permanent order into the annual fiscal authority, budget. As a former Red Army officer, he had the necessary natural sympathy for the Bolshevik policy of giving much priority to the Red Army. Fiscal responsibility. However, at the same time, Sokolnikov would never allow deficit spending, or any other kind of financial irregularities, which could only have been accomplished at that time by currency debasing money printing, as there were no internal domestic reserves of cash nor any foreign bank loans available to back up money printing. He imposed not only stability on the currency but fiscal discipline on the Sovnarkom. The problem confronting the government and its state, in this case the Red Army and Red Navy, when Sokolnikov took over, was that there was insufficient money available to do the things which were absolutely necessary. No matter how different chefs tried to cut up the pie, it was far too small to feed everyone. For example, the 1923 to 1924 government fiscal year featured an appropriation of only 380 MR, far less than the Revoensavet asterisk, this is the correct spelling, had requested, which was 427 MR. The government wanted to do more, much more. However, there had been a general collapse in grain exports because in early 1924 there had been a world market glut of grain. In that fiscal year, 1923 to 1924, the government received nearly nothing in the form of foreign exchange from agriculture and furthermore had to pour additional cash into the countryside to support purchases of necessary goods from the cities. And what the cities produced had to have an internal market if the workers were to survive. The Soviet government did receive foreign exchange in that fiscal year from the sale of oil, timber, precious metals, caviar, confiscated Tsarist luxury items, and diamonds. Revoensavet. From 1918 to 1934, the Revoensavet was highest decision-making body of the Red Army and Red Navy with members from both forces. The 1924 to 1925 budget authorization. The crisis was eased somewhat by the time of the Bolshevik Party January 1925 full Central Committee meeting, because the world market for grain had improved. There had been additional sale of minerals as well as oil and diamonds and some other metals, not to mention increased export of timber, so that the revenue stream had increased from 2.1 BR to nearly 2.3 BR. This additional unanticipated revenue of some 200 MR allowed the party to meet the urgent requests of War Commissar Mikhail Frunze. Frunze wanted to increase the Red Army from its all-time post-Civil War low of 562,000 men and women to 600,000 or more. And he wanted money for some investment in modernization. To get this appropriation for the military in the 1924 to 1925 fiscal year, Frunze had to have the intervention of Joseph Stalin at that January 1925 meeting, and he got it. This put an end to any more calls for a reduction in the Red Army budget or standing TONE, tables of organization and equipment. The 1925 to 1926 budget authorization. The Soviet Union was able to export 2 million tons of grain in this fiscal period. This greatly improved the financial health of Narkomfin, the Finance Commissariat, or Treasury. Accordingly, the January 1926 Central Committee full meeting voted to increase the overall military budget for 1925 to 1926 to 600 MR. In January 1926, this same Bolshevik Party Central Committee meeting ordered a change in chief commissars at Narkomfin. This resulted, among other things, in the first official deficit financing in the Soviet Union, in that at least 5 MR was deferred for payment until the next fiscal year, that of 1927 to 1928. As I say, at the January 1926 full Central Committee meeting, Nikolai Brukhanov replaced Sokolnikov as Commissar for Finance, Narkomfin. Brukhanov was another old Bolshevik, born in Simbirsk December 28, 1878, thus, another age mate of Stalin, and an original, 1903, member of the Bolshevik Party. You will recall 1903 was when Lenin had led his majorists, Bolshevik, faction out of the RSDLP. Lenin headquartered with his Bolsheviks in Geneva and Martov, and his minorists, Menshevik, faction established their headquarters in Zurich. Brukhanov had then built his career as the Bolshevik in charge of Ufa, editing the Ufa Worker beginning in 1907, and its surrounding region. Ufa was an important Tsarist industrial town located just to the west of the southern Urals mountains, and was an important center of Russian oil production. Brukhanov was less dead set on Sokolnikov's view of absolute fiscal discipline in that he was willing to set over modest amounts of payment until a future fiscal year. As long as these amounts were small, such as 5 MR, he thought the economy was healthy enough to allow such modest deficit spending. Stalin backed the replacement of Sokolnikov with Brukhanov. However, the critical question of how to get the Red Army modernized to a level sufficient to defeat all of the world's capitalist armies, together, or one or a few at a time, was still far from answered. To ensure this ability would require far more massive capital investment than anyone at this time was willing to consider. On October 16, 1925, the probability that such an attack would soon be organized had increased since France, the UK, Germany, Belgium, Poland and Italy had signed what they called the Locarno Pact. It was produced by the conference of these powers at Locarno, Switzerland, 5 to 16 October 1925. The pact formalized the denial of free trade terms to the USSR. It prepared the way for an anti-Bolshevik grand alliance of aggressor nations. This Locarno Agreement was history's second anti-communist European alliance. The first came after Marx's inaugural address for the First International, see Chapter 9, and the First Anti-Comintern Pact. It was not supplemented in ominosity until Hitler's Anti-Comintern Pact of Germany and Italy in 1936, eventually including Japan and Spain. The Rhine Treaties supplemented the 1925 Locarno Pact as follows. From the Great Soviet Encyclopedia 1970 to 1979. The Locarno Treaties of 1925. The initiators of the Locarno Conference pursued anti-Soviet goals. As notes from secret sessions of the conference indicate, 3 possible variations for German participation in actions, formally under the flag of the League of Nations, directed against the USSR were outlined: direct participation in war, indirect participation by allowing troops to cross German territory, and economic sanctions. Representatives of Germany, having initialed the Rhine Pact at the Locarno Conference, did not make any specific commitments to participate in anti-Soviet actions. Germany's position was dictated by its desire to preserve an independent foreign policy and, toward that end, to maintain relations with the Soviet Union. These relations had begun with the Rapallo Treaty of 1922. In 1926, a Soviet-German treaty on non-aggression and neutrality was concluded. This step considerably weakened the anti-Soviet thrust of the Locarno policy. On the whole, the Locarno Conference laid the foundation for a regrouping of the imperialist powers on the European continent. The 1926 to 1927 budget authorization. The last predictable financial fiscal year prior to the Great Turn and its mass-forced collectivization of agriculture, which began in August 1928, was this 1926 to 1927 fiscal year. Its budget featured a Revoensovjet request for 613 MR plus whatever amount the Rykov Commission thought would be necessary over and above this minimum readiness request. What was this all about? In April 1925, Alexei Rykov, the Prime Minister, decided to create a special commission, called Rykov's Commission or sometimes the Defense Commission, to evaluate areas of conflict between government agencies. This advisory body, which was to act as a separate and independent advisory body to the Prime Minister within the Sovnarkom, Council of Ministers. It consisted of 6 men with Premier Alexei Rykov as chairman and Lev Kamenev as vice-chair. The other 4 were Felix Dzerzhinsky, director of the Chaika and the Commissar of the National Economic Council, Commissariat of Industry or Vasenka. In industry, all the Chaika purloined foreign technology was to be inserted. Also on the Rykov Commission was Commissar Mikhail Frunze for the Red Army and Red Navy Commissariat, Deputy Commissar for the Red Army and Red Navy Commissariat Kliment Voroshilev, and Gregory Sokolnikov, Chief Commissar of the People's Commissariat for Finance. The Rykov Commission General Tukhachevsky's proposal for preventive war by 1926. One area of contention was the budget fight, now of greater significance because of the danger of imminent foreign attack, which General Tukhachevsky was campaigning to meet with a first strike. That is, a preventive war initiated by the Red Army, specifically against Poland and Romania. The Rykov Commission was to act as a separate advisory body for his Prime Minister's office. On January 19, 1926, Rykov replaced Kamenev, becoming sole chairman of the Soviet Council on Labor and Defense, abbreviated STO. The STO was a body Lenin had chaired before his stroke and which Kamenev had chaired since that time until now. Originally, when Lenin chaired it, it had played the key role in the articulation of the needs of the army and industry during the Civil War, but under Kamenev's leadership it had atrophied. Part of this was because the Revoensovjet had grown in importance in making recommendations and overseeing their implementation in matching the army with the needs of civilian industry. Part of the atrophy was due to Kamenev's legendary laziness. At any rate, Rykov now had independent instruments of analysis, if not decision-making, in his hands. On July 28, 1926, the Commission recommended an additional authorization of 510 MR, in addition to the 613 Mr. Basic allocations already authorized by the Central Committee. However, Narkomfin, the Finance Commissariat, refused to go along, saying it could under no circumstances authorize more than a total of 700 MR for the military with or without preventive war mobilization taken into account. As the end of 1927 approached, there were other crises the government faced. Specifically, the scissors crisis in agriculture, the falling behind in preparation of infrastructure for acquired industrial equipment implantation, and the collapse of the China policy. These were now aggravated by this deadlock over levels, ruble amounts, of military and military-industrial complex, MIC, spending. Now we shall expand our biographical knowledge with some additional information about the often little-known Alexei Rykov. Rykov was the head of government, Prime Minister, of both the Soviet Republic and the Soviet Union until 1930, when Molotov took over as the new head of government. Rykov was the first head of government after Vladimir Lenin. Alexei Rykov on February 13, 1881. Alexei Rykov was born in Saratov, Russia. His father died in Merv of cholera in 1889. His sister, who worked for the railroad, raised him. He became an atheist in high school, where he excelled in science and mathematics. In 1898, he joined the RSDLP, Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. In 1900, he attended Kazan University as a pre-law student. In 1903, he joined Lenin's Bolsheviks when the RSDLP split. In 1905, Rykov was active in the Bolshevik campaign within the Russian Revolution of that year in Petrograd and Moscow, and in the preparation for the national armed insurrection Lenin had set to begin in the spring of 1906, April 1st, as we reviewed in Chapter 10. He traveled to London for the RSDLP Rump Third Bolshevik Congress. Martov organized his own RSDLP Rump Third Menshevik Congress simultaneously in Zurich. In 1906, he traveled to the Fourth Bolshevik Congress in Copenhagen. In 1907, he attended the Fifth All-Factions RSDLP Congress in London, where Lenin brought him onto the Bolshevik Central Committee as a candidate member. In 1912, Rykov was captured by the Okhrana and exiled to Siberia, where he remained until the February 1917 revolution. He returned initially to Petrograd, where Stalin picked him as one of the Bolshevik Party delegates to the Petrograd, St. Petersburg, Leningrad, City Council, Soviet. At the Stalin-organized July-August 1917 Sixth Congress in Petrograd, Rykov was elected as a full member to the Central Committee. Lenin approved this, of course, although Stalin was keeping him in hiding in Finland when this Congress was held somewhat surreptitiously in Petrograd, as we discussed in Chapter 10. During the Bolshevik Revolution of 24 to 26 October, Old Style, Rykov was a member of the Military Revolutionary Committee that was conducting the seizure of power in its name. When the seizure was complete and Lenin announced said completion with himself as chairman of the Government of People's Commissars, in other words as Prime Minister of the insurrectionary government, Rykov was named Interior, Police, Commissar, Minister, in this first Red government. From Wikipedia. On April 3, 1918, Rykov was appointed chairman of the Supreme Council of National Economy, NEC in this text and Vasenka in most texts ed., and served in that capacity throughout the Russian Civil War. On July 5, 1919, he also became a member of the reorganized Revolutionary Military Council, where he remained until October 1919. From July 1919 and until August 1921, he was also a special representative of the Council of Labor and Defense, STO, ed., for food supplies for the Red Army and Navy. Rykov was elected to the Communist Party Central Committee on April 5, 1920 after the Ninth Party Congress and became a member of its Orgburo, Organizational Bureau, ed., where he remained until May 23, 1924. Once the Bolsheviks emerged victorious in the Civil War, Rykov resigned his Supreme Council of National Economy post on May 28, 1921. On May 26, 1921, he was appointed deputy chairman of the Council of Labor and Defense, STO, ed., of the RSFSR under Lenin. With Lenin increasingly sidelined by ill health, Rykov became his deputy at the Sovnarkom, Council of People's Commissars, the cabinet of the Soviet government, ed., on December 29. Rykov joined the ruling Politburo of the Bolshevik Party, ed., on April 3, 1922, after the 11th Party Congress. Government reorganization in the wake of the formation of the Soviet Union in December 1922 resulted in Rykov's appointment as chairman of the USSR Supreme Council of National Economy, Vasenka or NEC in this text, ed., and deputy chairman of the USSR Council of People's Commissars on July 6, 1923. After Lenin's 1922 stroke, the Politburo named Rykov co-acting head of government along with Lev Kamenev, on July 6, 1923, Rykov becoming the de facto premier or prime minister. After Lenin's January 21, 1924 death, Rykov formally succeeded him as head of government, a post he retained until the end of 1930 when Vyacheslav Vlad Molotov and his government replaced him and his government. The war danger UK and Germany? Poland and Romania? Tukhachevsky's thesis in May of 1923, Stanley Baldwin was the Tory, Conservative Party, Prime Minister of the UK. The focus of Baldwin's foreign policy was the destruction of Bolshevism via the overthrow of the Soviet government. At this time Lenin was in the depths of his final episode of strokes, and the party was being led by Joseph Stalin. Stalin focused the Chaika's foreign operations on staying informed about how this Brit plot to attack the USSR was progressing. We shall see, Chapter 13, that it took a while for the Baldwin plot to get off the ground. Then it was temporarily derailed by the rise to power of Hitler in 1933. And then delayed again with the January 1935 death of the first monarch, George V, that Baldwin served. Then Baldwin's plot was further obstructively delayed by the temporary replacement of George V by Edward VIII, David the Prince of Wales, later the Duke of Windsor. David was all for a German-led assault on the USSR, but he wanted to do it with Hitler in command of Germany. Baldwin wanted Hitler replaced first, by a German more acceptable to the British ruling class. London-Berlin-Rome axis. Baldwin's plan was to create a London-Berlin-Rome European capitalist axis, with a sober German at the helm of Germany. One historical occurrence after another kept creating delays in Baldwin's planning. It would not be until after King Edward's departure, and the way the Spanish Civil War developed, that Baldwin would agree, in November 1937, to accept Hitler as the chief of Germany and as the vanguard of his London-Berlin-Rome axis. Baldwin sent Lord Halifax to Hitler to formalize his surrender to Hitler's leadership. The CPSU-B Politburo led by Comrade Stalin was well aware of all of this Baldwin plotting. As we will see in Chapter 13, Baldwin's plot was the focus of the Brit tactics through the first year of the Spanish Civil War, which really focused Stalin on the potential threat of a London-Berlin-Rome axis against the USSR. After the September 1936 Stalin intervention in Spain, via direct USSR aid to the Spanish Republic, and the sending of internationalist troops, Baldwin's plot gave up its initial formulation. As I say, initially Baldwin had demanded the replacement of Hitler in Germany as an essential element of his plan, but in November 1937 Baldwin moved to accepting Hitler as chief of his proposed anti-Soviet London-Berlin-Rome axis. We shall see in detail how the Spanish Civil War played out and why Baldwin finally conceded to Hitler using Lord Halifax in November 1937 as his emissary, in Chapter 13. Flashback: East European enemies, Soviet Western frontier. After Lenin's January 21, 1924 death, and through the years 1925 and 1926, the primary concern of the War Commissar Mikhail Frunze, his successor War Commissar Klim Voroshilov, and their commanding general and chief of Red Army General Staff Mikhail Tukhachevsky, was with the immediate threat on their western frontier. The threat from revenge-seeking Poland was number one. The threat from feudal Romania was number two. Thirdly, the threat from the remaining motley crew in the reactionary East European satrapy of Bulgaria had to be countered. To lesser degrees were threats from the other reactionary regimes in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland. Tukhachevsky concluded after analyzing the combined weight of these enemies vis-a-vis the Red Army, that we could not win if we were attacked by their combined weight. One reason was that we would not be able to mobilize our great advantage in manpower in sufficient time. His answer was for the USSR to launch the first attack against these enemies. That is, to conduct a preventive war by delivering the first blow. His own strategy called, therefore, for a special kind of mass mobilization, including the construction of a special supportive military-industrial complex, and properly equipped Red Army, for such a strike. This would not be the long-term heavy industry-based strategy of other Red Army professionals. Tukhachevsky's military strategy thesis was not the first choice of the Bolshevik Party chief Joseph Stalin. There would be far-reaching ramifications to this division between Tukhachevsky and Stalin. At a meeting of Rykov's commission held July 29, 1926 to discuss mobilization readiness and the Red Army's 1926 to 1927 budget, Voroshilov and Chief of Staff Mikhail Tukhachevsky combined to paint a frightening picture of the underfunded Soviet military. Despite their personal rivalry, Tukhachevsky and Voroshilov could cooperate to defend the Red Army. Voroshilov told Rykov's commission that he had met privately with Dzerzhinsky, who died soon after their meeting. Dzerzhinsky had been warned him and Tukhachevsky of an impending attack on the USSR. This intelligence led Voroshilov to evaluate the Red Army's preparedness. Voroshilov found that the Locarno Agreement had only unsettled Eastern Europe, pushing Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states to active alignment against the USSR. To make matters worse, Britain was not only supporting that coalition but also fomenting anti-Soviet activities in Afghanistan and Iran. Tukhachevsky joined his colleague in asserting that the Soviet Union's western border states could draw on a pool of 6,710,000 men, of whom 4,290,000 had military training, allowing them to muster 111 rifle divisions, plus cavalry and aircraft. Given their reserves, these reactionary capitalist states could field additional 150 rifle divisions with British assistance and production from the rapidly growing Polish military industry. This weight against the 91 rifle divisions and 3.17 million men the USSR could field meant to Tukhachevsky that the Soviet Union could not prevail in an extended war. His solution was a strategy aiming at quick victory, a conclusion with profound implications for the allocation of resources. Scarce funds should not go to industrial investment, since by the time Soviet industry made its presence felt in any future war, sheer weight of numbers would tell against the USSR. Instead, because quick victory was essential, spending had to create a Red Army able to go on the offensive at a moment's notice and disrupt the deployment of forces by its enemies. Tukhachevsky buttressed his advocacy of preventive war by pointing out the sorry state of the Red Army's stockpiles. Nearly a third of soldiers mobilized would not have uniforms. There was a severe shortage of modern light machine guns, and the Red Army could count on repeating World War I's shell shortage almost as soon as the war began. Even given a year to expand production, Soviet industry would not approach the level of production the Red Army would require. In short, the Soviet Union would be incapable of repelling serious attack in the autumn of 1926. Here, Tukhachevsky drew the opposite conclusion from that drawn by Svechin in Strategy. Svechin had suggested that the path to victory lay through attrition in a long, defensive struggle. Tukhachevsky saw that as leading to defeat and pushed instead for preemptive strikes to counteract the Soviet Union's material weakness. Rykov agreed with Tukhachevsky that the situation demanded quick action, and his commission resolved to take a series of urgent measures for strengthening the defensive potential of the USSR. In particular, the Commission would consider advances on next year's budget due to the catastrophic position of mobilization stocks. Hammer and Stone, David R. Stone, 2000, University of Kansas Press, Lawrence, pages 22-23. Strategy by Alexander Svechin. Strategy was a textbook written by Alexander Svechin when he was a professor at the Red Army General Staff School. He had been assigned there after a brief stint as Red Army Chief of Staff under Jukums Vasiidis, the first Commander-in-Chief of the Red Army, and earlier after being the general in command of the Red Army's Smolensk district. Previously he had been an important general in the Tsarist army. The inherent problem with Tukhachevsky's solution was that most of the future appropriation would have to go to the purchase of materials that would strengthen the army now. Even, as the Rykov Commission's working group, led by Comrade Chutskiv, pointed out, the requested 510 Mr. appropriation would be far insufficient to address the longer-term necessity of building the war industries, with only 173 Mr. of that additional appropriation going to war industry. Furthermore, all sides realized that without the permission of the Finance Commissariat, which was already being specifically denied, all of this was just pissing into the wind. For the moment, January 7, 1927 Party Central Committee full membership meeting, the Finance Commissariat would have its way not only for the preceding fiscal year, 1925 to 1926, but for the present one as well, 1926 to 1927. The War Commissariat budget went from 602 plus Mr to 692 plus Mr, far less than it wanted. Additional grants went from 167 plus Mr to 386 plus Mr, plus equals, and change. Additional grants to military industry remained minimal, going from 27 plus to 44 Mr. Without more money, the USSR confronted defeat in protracted war. January 1928 Full Central Committee meeting 1927 to 1928 Budget authorization. Crises on the Soviet borders. Industry and agriculture. Why we could win. The party had one thing that made it feasible to win every battle it now confronted, including the most severe accumulation of specific crisis. That was its extremely good command and control of the entire administrative structure within the country, not to mention its ability to command fanatically loyal foreign de facto commando parties. This was Leninism in practice on a national and international level. This was also the logical extension of what General Secretary Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, his General and Chief of Staff, had done with the First International of Working Men. See the most recent biography of Frederick Engels entitled Marx's General, The Revolutionary Life of Friedrich Engels by former British Labour Party MP Tristram Hunt, 2009. By the time of the January 1928 Full Central Committee meeting in Moscow, the party had had a full 10 years to get its act together organizationally. Despite all odds, it had succeeded in doing so. Command and control administrative structure. The Soviet government was supposed to be, and was in fact, an implementation body for Bolshevik party policy. To the degree it made its own decisions, it was to the degree that it was necessary to do so in order to further party policy. In short, the Soviet government was a command government, and the CPSU, Political Bureau and Central Committee exercised that command. Through direct legal control, and through indirect but even more effective fanatical devotion of government cadre who were always party cadre. The CPSU, was also fundamentally an implementation apparatus for the highest party authority. This was as it should be. This was exactly what Leninism was always all about in terms of organization. Highest, in 1928, party authority was the General Secretary, Joseph Stalin, the full Politburo, the Secretariat, the Party Congress and its members, which included all of the party's regional bosses. 15th Party Congress 2-19 December 1927. This Congress at the end of 1927 had working committees, one of which dealt with the budgetary questions, including the military budgets, which would be the subject of a full 1928 Central Committee meeting. However, the overriding concerns confronting this Congress were political. Specifically, all left opposition members had been expelled from the Central Committee in October 1927. Then in November 1927, both Zinoviev and Trotsky had been expelled from the party itself. Christian Rakovsky and Lev Kamenev were allowed to speak to the December 1927 15th Congress. The reception was very hostile. Rakovsky's speech was interrupted 57 times by his opponents led by Bukharin, Ryutin, and Kaganovich. Kamenev was interrupted 24 times by the same group. At the end of the 15th Congress, both Rakovsky and Kamenev were expelled from the party. What we confronted in January 1928. There were three specific crises confronting the party and its government in 1928 at the beginning of that year. These were the complete collapse of the China policy the previous April, 1927, as we discussed in Chapter 11. The overall failure to complete the infrastructural preparation to implant all of the acquired foreign technology, and even domestically produced machinery. The scissors crisis in agriculture. At bottom, two of these crises were directly or indirectly related to having insufficient financial resources to resolve them. And this failure was itself due to having inherited an insufficiently developed capitalist mode of production. Affair at Shakhty Donbass region 1928. The Russian word for mineshaft is Shakhty. The extreme southwestern Russian city of Shakhty was originally a tiny hamlet devoted to coal mining founded in 1805 by a Tsarist sergeant major named Popov and known thereafter as Popova. It changed its name once again before receiving the name Shakhty under the Soviet government, after final liberation in the Civil War by Red Army General Sergei Ordzhonikidze in January 1921. Geographically, it is about 60 miles from Rostov-on-Don in the extreme southwestern corner of Russia in the Oblast of Rostov. After the counter-revolutionary traitor Gorbachev restored capitalism, the city fell apart economically and sunk into deep recession, but in its day, it was a show city, in many respects for the achievements of Stalinism as a civilization. Today it is being rebuilt under Mr. Putin. As you may recall, the Chaika was constantly being informed of quiet, but nevertheless real, subversive thought and conversations among the bourgeois specialists portion of the technical intelligentsia. You want to remember that this bourgeois specialist class never included the old Bolshevik specialists, nor did it include the newly emerging graduates of the red vocational and technical schools and universities. Between 1926 and 1928, the Shakhty coal-producing center had been falling behind its own production record. The Chaika had begun to investigate all of these centers of declining rates of production to determine if sabotage, foreign or domestic in origin, was involved. On March 28, 1928, prosecutors returned a case against managers at the Shakhty coal mines. The police work leading to the prosecutor's indictment had been done under the command of Chekist Genrik G. Yagoda, appointed to the task of investigating Shakhty by Chaika chief Vyacheslav Menzinsky. In April 1928, General Secretary Stalin commented that the Shakhty case proved that the bourgeoisie were using sabotage as a weapon against us, and that this danger would increase as our success in building the economic foundations of socialism grew. This was exactly as Lenin had predicted in his last testament. Some of the accused were shot, but most ended up in prison. Over the years, Leon Trotsky and his latter-day followers, to this day, have manufactured lie after lie about the trial and the motivation behind it. Unfortunately, in the heartland of imperialism, these lies are about all the student can find to do independent study. At any rate, you will have to get used to the fact that printed sources of information have been a pack of lies for well over half a century in the USA. Therefore, sources like Wikipedia have no way of responding to this except to reprint them. Wikipedia insists only on using published sources, which normally would be fine except in the areas of politics and history where everything in English about communism and Soviet Russia is a pack of lies. Wikipedia is further handicapped by the conspiracy of Trotskyists to sit on top of the pages at Wikipedia. They see as critical to their campaign of falsehood and calumny against communism in general and Stalin in particular. Now that you know this, you can work your way around some of it. You do this by looking up such things as the cities involved, the geographic areas and their history, industries in Russia and their history, personalities that the Trots may not be covering. What the Shakhty affair marks, of political and historical significance from our truthful perspective, is the point at which the party also felt it had no choice but to actively pursue a policy of replacing our inherently treasonous endemic enemies. They confronted us in the form of the old bourgeois specialists. This helped in bringing the Central Committee, the Politburo, and the General Secretary to the great turn. In 1935, the Donbass region would become the center of national attention again when Comrade Stakhanov emerged there as the hero who had produced 14 times his daily quota of coal in a little over 4 hours. We shall return to him and the Donbass coal mines story below. April 1928 Central Committee Meeting. Stalin addressed the full Central Committee meeting of April 6 to 11, 1928, spending the day of the 10th berating, beguiling and in general duplicating Lenin's conduct at the 1907 5th Congress of the RSDLP, all factions present, in London. As we proceed through this book, we shall revisit the budget authorization for this year, and what Stalin was willing to tell the assembled about his vision for the next year, and what he implied for the next 5 years, about budget authorizations and how they were to be paid. We shall do in-depth studies of a few select examples in industrialization and militarization of the Soviet Union alongside the reorganization of agriculture, which provided the lion's share of the funds to support both. Stalin's July 1928 Full Central Committee Meeting Report. Again in July, Stalin delivered the main report to the Full Central Committee and focused on three areas. 1. 2. The upcoming 6th Comintern Congress and the new conditions in the world. 3. The situation concerning industrialization. Beginning with a preview of what he would say to the upcoming 6th Comintern Congress. The principal capitalist contradictions. Now it is the struggle between British capital and US capital which is the major contradiction in the capitalist world. Without denigrating the other capitalist contradictions, e.g., US versus Japan, Britain versus France, etc., there is the potential for Anglo-American war, and certainly there will be war, here and there on the globe, between the imperialist wolves. The second capitalist contradiction is between the imperialist countries and their colonies. Last year's shaking up of the foundations of Chinese society, and because of our 5th Congress decisions, the shaking up of Indian society, foremost among them. The contradiction between the capitalist world and the Soviet Union which is becoming increasingly acute. There is the real possibility of war as the capitalists may well attack us. The main immediate danger comes from imperialist pacifism in the guise of social democratism that effectively disarms those classes we must rely upon in the capitalist countries to prevent war emanating from their countries. This camouflage of social democratic pacifism is always the left hand in the capitalist boxing strategy featuring fascism as its right-hand knockout punch. Firstly, to wage an unceasing struggle against social democratism in all spheres, in the economic and in the political sphere, including in the latter the exposure of bourgeois pacifism with the task of winning the majority of the working class for communism. Secondly, to form a united front of the workers of the advanced countries and the laboring masses of the colonies in order to stave off the danger of war, or, if war breaks out, to convert imperialist war into civil war, smash fascism, overthrow capitalism, establish Soviet power, emancipate the colonies from slavery, and organize all-round defense of the first Soviet republic in the world. Now let us turn to questions concerning our internal development. I am including the entire English translation of Stalin's report now, as it is important for you to get a direct original source view of how the boss saw the situation. 2. Questions of socialist construction in the USSR. 1. Grain procurement policy. Permit me to give a little historical information. What was the position by January 1st of this year? You know from the party documents that by January 1st of this year we had a deficit of 128 million poods of grain. 1 pood equals 36.11 pounds ed, as compared with the corresponding period last year. I shall not dilate on the reasons for this. They are set forth in the party documents published in the press. The important thing for us now is that we had a deficit of 128 million poods. Yet only 2 or 3 months remained until the spring thaw on the roads. We were thus faced with the alternative, either to make up for lost time and establish a normal rate of grain procurement in the future, or to face the inevitability of a serious crisis of our entire national economy. What had to be done to make up for lost time? It was necessary, in the first place, to strike at the kulaks and speculators who were forcing up grain prices and threatening the country with hunger. It was necessary, in the second place, to consign the maximum quantity of manufactured goods to the grain-growing regions. It was necessary, lastly, to rouse all our party organizations into activity and bring about a radical change in all our grain procurement work by putting an end to the practice of allowing things to go of their own accord. Thus we were compelled to resort to emergency measures. The measures we took proved effective, and by the end of March, we had been able to secure 275 million poods of grain. We not only made up for lost time, we not only averted a crisis of our whole economy, we not only caught up with last year's rate of grain procurement, we also had every possibility of emerging from the procurement crisis painlessly, if we maintained any normal rate of procurement in the subsequent months. April, May and June. Owing, however, to the failure of the winter crops in the South Ukraine, and partly in the North Caucasus, the Ukraine completely, and the North Caucasus partially, dropped out as supplying regions, depriving the Republic of 20 million to 30 million poods of grain. This circumstance, combined with the fact that we had permitted an overexpenditure of grain, faced us with the unavoidable necessity of pressing harder on the other regions and thus of encroaching on the peasants' emergency stocks, and this could not but worsen the situation. Whereas we had succeeded in January-March in securing nearly 300 million poods affecting only the peasants' maneuvering stocks, in April-June we failed to secure even 100 million poods owing to the fact that we had to encroach on the peasants' emergency stocks, and at a time, moreover, when the harvest prospects were not yet clear. Nevertheless, grain had to be secured. Hence the renewed recourse to emergency measures, the arbitrary administrative measures, the infringements of revolutionary law, the house-to-house visitations, and the unlawful searches and so on, which worsened the political situation in the country and created a threat to the bond. Was this a rupture of the bond? No, it was not. Was it, perhaps, some trifling matter not worthy of consideration? No, it was not a trifling matter. It was a threat to the bond between the working class and the peasantry. That, in fact, explains why some of our party workers lack the calmness and firmness necessary for appraising the situation soberly and without exaggeration. The subsequent good harvest prospects and the partial withdrawal of the emergency measures helped to calm the atmosphere and improve the situation. What is the nature of our difficulties on the grain front? What is the basis of these difficulties? Is it not a fact that we now have a grain crop area nearby as large as before the war, only 5% smaller? Is it not a fact that we are now producing nearly as much grain as before the war, about 5,000 million poods, or only 200 million to 300 million poods less? How is it that, in spite of this, we are producing only half as much marketable grain as in the pre-war period? It is because of the highly scattered character of our agriculture. Whereas before the war we had about 16 million peasant farms, now we have not less than 24 million. Moreover, the splitting up of the peasant households and peasant holdings is showing no tendency to cease. And what is small? Peasant farming? It is the form of husbandry that produces the smallest marketable surplus, is the least remunerative, and is in the highest degree a natural, consuming form of husbandry, yielding a surplus of only 12 to 15% of marketable grain. Yet our towns and industry are growing rapidly, construction is developing, and the demand for marketable grain is growing at incredible speed. That is the basis of our difficulties on the grain front. Here is what Lenin said on this score in his speech on the tax in kind. If peasant farming can develop further, we must firmly assure its transition to the next stage too, and this transition to the next stage will inevitably consist in the small, isolated peasant farms, the least profitable and most backward, gradually uniting to form socially conducted, large farms. That is how socialists have always conceived it. That is how our Communist Party conceives it. Volume 26, page 299. There, then, is the basis of our difficulties on the grain front. What is the way out? The way out is, firstly, to improve small and middle peasant farming, giving it every encouragement to expand its yield, its productivity. Our task is to replace the wooden plow by the steel plow, to supply pure seed, fertilizer and small types of machines, to embrace the individual peasant farms in a broad cooperative network by concluding agreements, contracts, with whole villages. There exists the method of concluding contracts between agricultural cooperatives and entire villages, the purpose of which is to supply the peasants with seed and thus obtain higher crop yields, to ensure the prompt delivery of grain by the peasants to the state, giving them in return a bonus in the shape of a certain addition to the contractual price, and to create stable relations between the state and the peasantry. Experience shows that this method is productive of tangible results. There are people who think that individual peasant farming has exhausted its potentialities and that there is no point in supporting it. That is not true, comrades. These people have nothing in common with the line of our party. There are people, on the other hand, who think that individual peasant farming is the be-all and end-all of agriculture. That also is not true. More, these people are obviously sinning against the principles of Leninism. We need neither detractors nor eulogizers of individual peasant farming. We need sober-minded politicians capable of obtaining from individual peasant farming the maximum that can be obtained from it, and at the same time capable of gradually transferring individual farming to collectivist lines. The way out, secondly, is gradually to unite the isolated small and middle peasant farms into large collective and cooperative farms, which should be absolutely voluntary associations operating on a new technical basis, on the basis of tractors and other agricultural machines. In what does the advantage of collective farms over small farms consist? In the fact that they are large farms and are therefore able to utilize all the results of science and technology. They are more remunerative and stable. They are more productive and yield larger marketable surpluses. It should not be forgotten that the collective farms yield a surplus of from 30 to 35% of marketable grain, and that their yield is sometimes as high as 200 poods per deciton or more. The way out, lastly, is to improve the old state farms and establish new large state farms. It should be remembered that the state farms are the economic units that produce the largest marketable surpluses. We have state farms, which yield a surplus of not less than 60% of marketable grain. The task is correctly to combine all these three tasks and to work strenuously along all these three lines. The specific feature of the present moment is that fulfillment of the first task, that of improving individual small and middle peasant farming, while it is still our chief task in the sphere of agriculture, is already insufficient for the solution of the problem as a whole. The specific feature of the present moment is that the first task must be supplemented by two new practical tasks: promotion of collective farming and improvement of state farming. But besides the basic causes, there were also specific, temporary causes which converted our procurement difficulties into a procurement crisis. What are these causes? The resolution of the plenum of the Central Committee includes among them the following. A disturbance of market equilibrium, aggravated by a more rapid increase of the peasants' effective demand than of the supply of manufactured goods, owing to the rise of rural incomes resulting from a series of good harvests, and especially to the rise of incomes of the well-to-do and kulak strata. B. An unfavorable relation between grain prices and the prices of other agricultural produce, which lessened the incentive to sell grain surpluses, and which the party, however, could not change in the spring of this year without damaging the interests of the economically weaker strata of the rural population. C. Mistakes in plan management, chiefly as regards the timely consignment of manufactured goods to the countryside and the incidence of taxation, the low tax on the wealthier strata of the rural population, and also as regards proper expenditure of grain stocks. D. Defects of the party and Soviet procurement organizations, no united front, lack of energetic action, reliance on things going of their own accord. E. Infringement of revolutionary law, arbitrary administrative measures, house-to-house visitations, partial closing of local markets, etc. F. Exploitation of all these unfavorable factors by the capitalist elements of town and country, kulaks, speculators, in order to undermine grain procurement and worsen the political situation in the country. While it will require several years to put an end to the general causes, it is quite possible to do away at once with the specific, temporary causes and thus avert the possibility of a repetition of the grain procurement crisis. What is required in order to put an end to these specific causes? It requires A. Putting an immediate stop to the practice of house-to-house visitations, unlawful searches and all other infringements of revolutionary law. B. Putting an immediate stop to any kind of reversion to the surplus appropriation system and to all attempts whatsoever to close peasant markets, with the adoption by the state of flexible forms of regulating trade. C. A certain increase of grain prices, differentiated according to region and kind of grain. D. Proper organization of the consignment of manufactured goods to the grain procurement areas. E. Proper organization of the supply of grain, not permitting overexpenditure. F. Formation, without fail, of a state grain reserve. An honest and systematic carrying out of these measures, taking into account this year's favorable harvest, should create a situation that will rule out the necessity of resorting to emergency measures of any kind in the coming grain procurement campaign. It is the immediate task of the party to see to it that these measures are carried out faithfully. The grain difficulties have faced us with the question of the bond, of the future of the alliance between the workers and peasants, of the means of strengthening this alliance. Some say that the bond no longer exists, that the bond has been replaced by estrangement. That, of course, is foolish and worthy only of panic mongers. When there is no bond, the peasant loses faith in the morrow, he retires into himself, he ceases to believe in the stability of the Soviet government, which is the chief purchaser of peasant grain, he begins to reduce his crop area, or at any rate does not risk enlarging it, fearing that there will again be house-to-house visitations, searches and so on, and that his grain will be taken away from him. But what do we find in reality? We find that the spring crop area has been enlarged in all areas. It is a fact that in the principal grain-growing areas the peasant has enlarged his spring crop area by from 2% to 15 and 20%. Is it not clear that the peasant does not believe that the emergency measures will be permanent, and has every ground for believing that grain prices will be raised? Does that look like estrangement? This, of course, does not mean that there is no threat, or that there has been no threat to the bond. But to conclude from this that there is estrangement is to lose one's head and become a slave to elemental forces. Some comrades think that, in order to strengthen the bond, the main stress must be shifted from heavy industry to light industry, textiles, believing that textiles are the principal and exclusive bond industry. That is not true, comrades. It is quite untrue. Of course, the textile industry is of enormous importance for the establishment of goods exchange between socialist industry and peasant farming. But to think for this reason that textiles are the exclusive basis of the bond is to commit a very gross error. Actually, the bond between industry and peasant farming is maintained not only through cotton goods, which the peasant requires for his personal consumption, but also through metals and through seed, fertilizer and agricultural machines of all kinds, which the peasant requires as a producer of grain. That is apart from the fact that the textile industry itself cannot develop or exist unless heavy industry, machine building, develops. The need for the bond is not in order to preserve and perpetuate classes. The bond is needed in order to bring the peasantry closer to the working class, to re-educate the peasant, to remold his individualist mentality, to remake him in the spirit of collectivism, and thus pave the way for the elimination, the abolition of classes on the basis of a socialist society. Whoever does not realize this, or refuses to recognize it, is not a Marxist, not a Leninist, but a peasant philosopher, who looks backward instead of forward. And how is the peasant to be remolded? First and foremost, he can be remolded only through new technical equipment and through collective labor. Here is what Lenin says on this score. The remaking of the small tiller, the remolding of his whole mentality and habits, is a work of generations. As regards the small tiller, this problem can be solved. His whole mentality can be put on healthy lines, so to speak, only by the material base, by technical means, by introducing tractors and machines in agriculture on a mass scale, by electrification on a mass scale. That is what would remake the small tiller fundamentally and with immense rapidity. Volume 26, page 239. Quite clearly, he who thinks that the bond can be guaranteed only through textiles, and forgets about metals and machines, which transform peasant farming through collective labor, helps to perpetuate classes. He is not a proletarian revolutionary, he is a peasant philosopher. Here is what Lenin says in another passage. Only if we succeed in practice in showing the peasants the advantages of common, collective, cooperative, artel cultivation of the soil, only if we succeed in helping the peasant by means of cooperative, artel farming, will the working class, which holds state power in its hands, actually prove to the peasant the correctness of its policy and actually secure the real and durable following of the vast masses of the peasantry. Volume 24, page 579. That is how to ensure that the vast masses of the peasantry are really and durably won over to the side of the working class, to the side of socialism. It is sometimes said that to guarantee the bond we have only one reserve: concessions to the peasantry. On this assumption, the theory of continuous concessions is sometimes advanced, in the belief that the working class can strengthen its position by making continuous concessions. That is not true, comrades. It is quite untrue. Such a theory can only ruin matters. It is a theory of despair. In order to strengthen the bond, we must have at our disposal, besides the reserve of concessions, a number of other reserves, in the shape of economic strong points in the countryside, developed cooperatives, collective farms, state farms, and also in the shape of political strong points, energetic work among the poor peasants and assured support on the part of the poor peasants. The middle peasantry is a vacillating class. If we do not have the support of the poor peasant, if the Soviet government is weak in the countryside, the middle peasant may swing towards the kulak. And, on the contrary, if we have the sure support of the poor peasant, it may be said with certainty that the middle peasant will swing towards the Soviet government. Hence, systematic work among the poor peasants and ensuring them both seed and low-cost grain is an immediate task of the party. 2. Training of cadres for work of industrial construction. Let us pass now to the question of providing our industry with new cadres of a technical intelligentsia. Stalin's classless intelligentsia. Ed. This question concerns our difficulties in industry, difficulties which came to light in connection with the Shakti affair. What is the essence of the Shakti affair from the point of view of the improvement of industry? The essence and significance of the Shakti affair lies in the fact that we proved to be practically unarmed and absolutely backward, scandalously backward, in the matter of providing our industry with a certain minimum of experts devoted to the cause of the working class. The lesson of the Shakti affair is that we must expedite the formation, the training, of a new technical intelligentsia consisting of members of the working class devoted to the cause of socialism and capable of technically directing our socialist industry. That does not mean that we shall discard those experts who are not Soviet-minded or not communists, but who are willing to cooperate with the Soviet government. It does not mean that. We shall continue to strive with might and main to enlist the cooperation of non-party experts, non-party technicians, who are prepared to work hand in hand with the Soviet government in building our industry. We by no means demand that they should renounce their social and political opinions at once, or change them immediately. We demand only one thing, and that is that they should cooperate with the Soviet government honestly, once they have voluntarily agreed to do so. But the point is that such old experts who are prepared to work hand in hand with the Soviet government are becoming relatively fewer and fewer. The point is that it is absolutely necessary to have a new force of young experts to succeed them. Well, the party considers that the new replacements must be brought into being at an accelerated rate if we do not want to be faced with new surprises, and that they must come from the working class, from among the working people. That means creating a new technical intelligentsia capable of satisfying the needs of our industry. This is the new class that Stalin names as the classless intelligentsia. Ed. The facts show that the People's Commissariat of Education has failed to cope with this important task. We have no reason to believe that, if left to itself, the People's Commissariat of Education, which has very little connection with industry, and which is inert and conservative into the bargain, will be able to cope with this task in the near future. The party, therefore, has come to the conclusion that the work of speedily forming a new technical intelligentsia must be divided among three People's Commissariats: the People's Commissariat of Education, the Supreme Council of National Economy, and the People's Commissariat of Transport. The party considers that this is the most expedient way of ensuring the required speed in this important work. That is why a number of technical colleges have been transferred to the Supreme Council of National Economy, and the People's Commissariat of Transport. This, of course, does not mean that transfer of technical colleges is all that is required for speedily forming new cadres of a technical intelligentsia. Undoubtedly, material provision for the students will be a highly important factor. The Soviet government has therefore decided to rate the expenditure on the training of new cadres on the same level of importance as expenditure on the capital development of industry, and has decided to allocate annually an additional sum of over 40 million rubles for this purpose. 3. Conclusion. It must be admitted, comrades, that we have always learned from our difficulties and blunders. At any rate, it has been the case so far that history has taught us and tempered our party in the school of difficulties, of crises of one kind or another, of mistakes of one kind or another that we have committed. So it was in 1918, when, as a result of our difficulties on the Eastern Front, of our reverses in the fight against Kolchak, we realized at last the necessity of creating a regular infantry, and really did create it. So it was in 1919, when, as a result of the difficulties on the Denikin Front, of Mamontov's raid into the rear of our armies, we realized at last the necessity of having a strong regular cavalry, and really did create it. I think that this is more or less the case today. The grain difficulties will not have been without their value for us. They will stir Bolsheviks into action and impel them to tackle in earnest the work of developing agriculture, especially of developing grain farming. Had it not been for these difficulties, it is doubtful whether the Bolsheviks would have tackled the grain problem seriously. The same must be said of the Shakti affair and the difficulties resulting from it. The lessons of the Shakti affair will not, and cannot be without their value for our party. Think that these lessons will impel us to face squarely the problem of creating a new technical intelligentsia capable of serving our socialist industry. By the way, you see that we have already taken the first serious step towards the solution of the problem of creating a new technical intelligentsia. Let us hope that this step will not be the last. Stormy and prolonged applause. Entire party leadership leads 1928 great turn. Since 1917 the entire Central Committee had met frequently, and in 1928 full meetings occurred 4 times in 1 year. From October 1917, old style, through 1924, the Central Committee met 69 times, roughly 10 times per year or once every 37 days. In 1928, the full Central Committee met 4 times, roughly quarterly. Both Lenin and Stalin were leaders of a dedicated group of Bolshevik cadre in charge of the nation, its government, and state via the operations of the Bolshevik Party. This was the dictatorship of the proletariat in practice. These frequent and regular Central Committee meetings show us that continuing into 1928 Joseph Stalin was far from being a sole leader of the proletarian dictatorship. And that, like Lenin before him, was in fact the leader of a tightly knit increasingly larger group of usually theoretically unified old Bolsheviks. All of them were equally devoted to resolving the problems of their time in favor of the global socialist revolution. If they met 4 times a year in 1928, rather than approximately 10 times a year in the first 6 years of the revolution, this had to do with the fact that the CC was much larger in 1928. It had many standing committees that were in continuous session. These committees dealt full-time with items that would have been only on an agenda for a full meeting before, but now were being dealt with continuously by Bolshevik Party specialists. Furthermore, the Central Committee in 1928 represented a geographic expanse immeasurably larger than the relatively small expanse of the Soviet Republic in January of 1924 when Vladimir Lenin died. Accordingly, with all the travel restraints imposed by a nation that extended from Poland to Vladivostok. In addition, in 1928, the entire Politburo was virtually in continuous session all year long. First, there had been the January CC meeting, the time of which was rather traditional. And that meeting dealt with most of the accumulated purely political and theoretical problems. Then there had been the April full CC meeting directed at internal problems of agriculture and industrialization. Then the July meeting when Stalin spelled out the new international line and the new domestic line we have just reviewed. Now in November 1928, came a 4th full CC meeting devoted to the problems of agriculture and military preparation for what had seemed to be an imminent capitalist attack on the Soviet Union's western frontiers. To recap 1928. Central Committee meetings. The January 1928 meeting had confronted the complete collapse of the China policy the previous April, 1927, as we discussed in Chapter 11. And the overall failure to complete the infrastructural preparation to implant all of the acquired foreign technology, and even domestically produced machinery. Finally, the scissors crisis in agriculture. The April 1928 meeting had addressed what Stalin called important questions in a unified way for the first time in several years thanks to the liquidation of the opposition. The party now continued in a responsible and unanimous way. These important questions being the Shakti affair and the crisis in agriculture. The July 1928 meeting had focused on the internal danger from inherently anti-communist bourgeois industrial specialists in alliance with foreign capitalists. and the need to press for collectivization in agriculture. Finally, the need to step up the preparation of a new classless intelligentsia of technocrats. Now, at the end of November 1928, the Central Committee surgically approached the problem of modernizing the Red Army, and the industry needed to support it. Those of you interested in the blow-by-blow fighting between all interested parties are referred to Stone's Hammer and Rifle pages 86 to 107. The bottom line, as Stone says in his concluding paragraph to this essay, the end of Chapter 4. Modernization made the Red Army better able to fight the USSR's next war. But what Voroshilov, Unschlicht, Shaposhnikov, Tukhachevsky and their fellow officers required was industrialization to enable the Soviet economy to produce the accoutrements of modern war and the budget to buy them. Their convictions, increasingly shared by Stalin and the Politburo, grew over 1927 and 1928 to give added emphasis to Vysenka's, NEC's, and Gosplan's race to draw up increasingly ambitious industrialization plans. The first five-year plan, informed by the military's growing demands for modern equipment and drawn up in an atmosphere permeated by fear of foreign saboteurs, would finally turn the corner to rearming the Soviet military. When we speak about revolution, it is usually because we are working with workers, farmers, and other oppressed strata against the ruling oligarchy of capitalists and their allied classes. In other words, we are speaking about the classical revolution from below. Now, in 1928, in the Soviet Union, the workers were at the top of society, allied with other classes and strata, especially their bond with the farmers. At the head of the workers were their revolutionary Bolshevik party, with both the government, the Soviet local, county, republic and federal levels of Soviet government, and the state, the army, navy and federal and republic level police uniformed in secret, in its hands. Thus, the revolution could continue from above rather than from below. Stalin's revolution from above, that is from the workers' government, was of a new type and justifiable, given that it was led by the workers' vanguard party and its government now with state power in its hands and its bond with the farming masses. 1. 2. In the priorities of the working class and the industrial centers of the nation. We cannot disapprove of revolution from above as long as we understand that this continuation of the October Revolution was perfectly correct given the new historical conditions where the working class led society. This great turn in domestic orientation replaced NEP and practically manifested itself in the policies of the higher instruments of party policy, and the party's absolute control of state power, the military, and the Cheka. The key to the resolution of two of these problems we have discussed, and which are detailed in the initial chapters of David R. Stone's book Hammer and Rifle, the militarization of the Soviet Union 1926 to 1933, had to come from the acquisition of new sources of revenue. The collectivization of agriculture would provide the party and its government with those resources. The priorities of the working class and the industrial centers, old and new, would favor the Red Army. Because the prime task of the Bolshevik Party was to retain state power, and this meant getting ready for the next and inevitable round of war with the surrounding imperialist states. Thus, we shall now concentrate on these two threads of the Great Turn. Five-year plan. Throughout 1928, Stalin adjusted the pace of events in agriculture, trying to decide how to maximize the speed of the collectivization once the first five-year plan officially got underway in August. He found that rapidly expanding its scope, geographical broadness, as well as its depth, the actual collection of tools, animals and other farm equipment and livestock, had overall given the best results. In other words, seizing everything, everywhere, worked best. What also became apparent was the inability of the agricultural capitalists and their sympathizers to keep pace with the government's increasing demands. And the party's use of 1. Agitators to whip up the poor and middle farmers, and then the employment of 2. Armed troops, uniformed Chekists. The latter supported when and where necessary by the Red Army, to see these decisions carried out with maximum speed and thoroughness. The Kulaks lost out altogether, immediately, and were deported to virgin lands in Siberia or Soviet Central Asia, to begin again as common farmers. Exiled for 5 years, they could eventually return but were forever banned because of class background from participating in the collective farms or farming cooperatives. Thus, after starting over again as common farmers for 5 years, they could eventually confront the need to find other kinds of employment in the cities. Consequently, most of the adult deportees did not return, but of their children most would. This would be a problem for the Soviet government. It had only set over for 5 years, and the party and the government would eventually have to deal with these vacillating offspring. The industrial half of the Stalinist solution moved along much more smoothly than did the situation in the countryside. The reason for this was the Bolsheviks' complete control of the labor movement in the cities, and their decade of experience in organizing the national economy and securing it international partners in development, those willing or unknowing. A huge amount of industrial espionage had been underway for many years, all of it under the direct supervision of the boss. The agricultural half of this resolution was more difficult, but it was accomplished. Great struggle for collectivization and industrialization, no retreat, no surrender. The idea of collectivizing agriculture in these smallholding farmer kinds of countries goes back to Karl Marx. Lenin had also written about it from a theoretical standpoint. The idea of massive industrialization was feasible if one had the money, and having the money had been the central contradiction of the post-Lenin government aided and abetted by the bourgeois specialists versus the old Bolsheviks contradiction. Would this be the end of the story? No. Bolsheviks do not give up. Bolsheviks do not surrender and do not retreat for long. As we have seen, Stalin had been forced into a corner by history. Now he had finally decided what to do. Namely, to both collectivize agriculture and industrialize the nation simultaneously. However, he was not the sole leader. He had to work carefully to maintain his plurality in the political bureau, the Central Committee, and in the party congresses and conferences. We have just seen that is exactly what he had been doing. He proved to be an excellent politician and he kept his markers out. The first 5-year plan, his answer for industrialization. He had found the solution for the financing of the Red Army and the equally important national industrialization to the most modern levels. That solution would be to take all of the nation's agricultural produce into the Soviet government's coffers. Along with the wealth already coming from timber, oil, minerals, diamonds, furs, caviar, and other exotic products, he would finally have all the money he needed. With it he could finish building the capitalist technological infrastructure and basic, then modern, industry the Bolsheviks should have inherited. Soviet farmers proudly raised their heads from embarrassing dead weight to a great national asset. In other words, to pay the cost of industrialization, Stalin needed a lot of money. Collectivization gave him that money. And collectivization gave the farmers a national social self-respect they had only previously enjoyed in Socialist Revolutionary Party and Bolshevik Party propaganda. Mechanically, the party got much of the agricultural wealth internally from 1. The turnover tax, a kind of sales tax at the point of origin of all sales, collections, on the collective farm grain produced. At this point the government took what it was due and paid the collective farm for the difference at the wholesale price the government set. Additionally, 2. By determining the price of bread, per loaf, to individual consumers, also according to a predetermined retail rate forecast in the plan, the party introduced an entirely new non-market pricing mechanism. In summary, the party had turned grain, meaning in totality, wheat, oats, rye, barley, sorghum, rice, potatoes and sugar beets, into a multiple revenue stream producing asset. Together these two factors eventually incorporated about 60 to 90% of the farmer's wealth, and the average industrial worker's income, harnessing it to national development. Previous 5 years lead Stalin to this solution economics of socialism in Stalinist socialist stage. The party through its government determined the wholesale price per ton paid to the collective farms, and determined the retail price per loaf that workers had to pay for their daily bread. In this way, the overwhelming agricultural product of the nation was transferred in ownership from the petty capitalist small farmers into the national treasury. Simultaneously, the secondary sale to the consumer, i.e., the party-determined retail price, was turned into another profit center for the government. In a sense, one could say that the 90% of the population inherited by the Bolsheviks, the Imperial Russian peasants, in the USSR, which had been an absolute dead weight on the nation's growth, had been transformed into Soviet communism's greatest growth asset. Soviet agricultural people were now true farmers and had been transformed from being an embarrassingly primitive, disgusting ball and chain into proud, independent, upstanding men and women with a critical role to play in the growth of the revolutionary nation. Conversely, in the first world of rule by the super-rich handful of millionaire and billionaire families, farmers were considered poor white trash and played the role of an ignorant and most foolish lowest form of life. A form subjected to every form of inhumanity and indignity that capitalism had determined for the mass of farmers living in the capitalist countries. It was even worse for the colonies of the European capitalist world in its industrialization. In the USA, the role assigned to African Americans and their competing pro-white trash in the most backward states, as well as the Latin Americans at home and abroad under the jackboot of gringo imperialism, was of the same incredibly cruel lowest order. To compare and contrast, the increasingly educated masses of the world, as well as in the Soviet Union, began to see a real new world order was indeed possible. It was worth fighting and dying for. The dialectical converse was that the world's ruling classes saw that they had to attack and destroy this example because their system was now exposed and bankrupt. It is for this same reason that the gringo oligarchs persist in their anti-Cuba embargo policy today, using the Miami Mafia of Diaz-Balarts and Rosletanins as the Goebbels and Goering of gringo fascism. July 1928 NEP will not suffice, Stalin informs Central Committee. The time is at hand. In 1927, the economic crisis had been deepening. And not just because of the kulaks, or the inherent problems we have just reviewed. As the spring of 1928 concluded, and the news from China had had a full year to sink into the minds of the Politburo, Stalin called an emergency full meeting, plenary session, of the entire Central Committee. They would hear what he had to say about the crisis in industrialization. Stalin spoke from a stage at his Kremlin theater to a large body of the most loyal and dedicated members of the Communist Party with a series of charts enlarged and lighted behind him. Stalin explained to his colleagues the details of the current crisis and what he intended to do about it. Stalin handled the entire meeting personally and, something rare for him, never stopped talking, cajoling, persuading, browbeating, until he got everyone into line. This is what Lenin had done in the most important party congresses, e.g., the 1907 Party 5th Congress in London, where Stalin had been present, as you may recall from Chapter 10, and had learned well from his mentor. The substance of the internal crisis in agriculture we reviewed above by reproducing Stalin's critical presentation in his own words. As the July Central Committee meeting concluded, Stalin summed it up. By mid-1928, the crisis was deepening to its greatest extent because of success, i.e., the Chayka's Economic Directorate priority, to which so much funding had been allocated, had paid off and all the targeted equipment was on hand. However, the necessary infrastructure to support all the new incoming factories and equipment simply was not being finished on time. Consequently, machinery was piling up everywhere in the Soviet Union waiting for the completion of the infrastructural basics. Inside snapshot. July 1928 Central Committee meeting. Comrades, far worse for us at the moment than anything happening in China is the fact that we have hundreds of millions of dollars worth of brand new machinery sitting under tarpaulins in the rain, and soon it will be snow and ice. If we don't get that equipment installed now, quickly, we may lose a great deal of it. The only way to make this stuff impregnable to weathering is to get it working. I am going to have to replace the shock teams I have been using so far to meet each of these bottlenecks with a mass movement of the Soviet population into preparation of the infrastructure. We have to have the basics now. By which I mean the foundations of these steel plants behind the Urals will have to be implanted with the blast furnaces and steel pouring equipment, and steel being produced even before the walls and roofs are finished. We have to get the dams finished that supply the power we need at Magnetic Mountain, Magnitogorsk. We must have this hydroelectric power and the dams at least partially functioning if we are to get our aluminum manufacturing equipment installed and producing before it too goes to rust. Those infrastructural basics have to be ready to receive that power even if they have no foundations, walls or roofs. Regardless of sacrifice, our aluminum plants will be ready to receive power. At Gorky, Nizhny Novgorod, we need steel assembly roofing plants constructed now if we hope to get our truck industry producing with all the new American components and manufacturing equipment right now, and if we hope to have the main plant completed before next year. Even then, none of those automotive plant buildings will have walls in their first 9 months. The list goes on, but what it means is we need millions of workers sent to new infrastructural tasks. There can be no fucking around here, comrades. Either we industrialize regardless of the costs or we are defeated. We have perhaps 10 years to get ready. Either we do it or they crush us. My plan to solve this crisis is in what Gauss plan and I am calling, as many of you know, our first 5-year plan. Under its auspices we can work with a draft of all able-bodied unemployed men and women to go to the production fronts, such as those just mentioned, and they can be paid as we can afford to pay them. Meaning, specifically in terms of wages, we can feed them and their families, and as we can, we will distribute cash to them as well. In terms of hours and working conditions, it will be up to the party cadre to convince workers of the importance to their own well-being, and their own government and state, to make new agriculture work and to make the industrial implantation work. These steps and the coming first plan will mean the end of unemployment in the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, that will still not be enough labor power. We need 10 million industrial shock workers today. We will get them within a year, but they will have to come from agriculture. We will need 30 million of these infrastructural workers by the 3rd year of the plan. Once collectivization gets underway, we will have them. Comrade Stalin, to get 10 million workers from agriculture will require a complete restructuring of agriculture, will it not? Yes, by the next fiscal year. This begins in 3 months. So I need you to authorize these steps now. There were more questions, more answers for the better part of the day. The Politburo and the entire Central Committee listened to what the chief had to say. They had read all the briefing papers and appendices prior to the meeting as provided by Stalin's top bureaucrat and fellow Politburo member, Vyacheslav Molotov. Finally, they voted unanimous approval. What else could one do? What choice did Bolshevism have in the real world of hostile capitalist encirclement? The fist again. By 1926, a new class of rich farmers had clearly emerged. In only 5 years, a new agrarian ruling class had arisen. These were called kulaks, after the rich farmers of the Tsarist period, who acted as the gendarmes of the Tsar's dictatorship in the countryside and thus were referred to as the fists of the regime. The new rich farmers were assigned their old name again, kulak being the Russian word for fist. Below them in wealth were the middle farmers, who were a very large percentage of the farming population, and finally the poor farmers, and then the agricultural laborers. However, the commanding heights of village and countryside production were dominated again by these new rich farmers. These rich farmers could and did determine black market prices by storing, withholding, and selling as market conditions dictated, the largest and most significant percentage of total village or area grain and meat output. In 1926, kulaks began to flex their newly created muscles. They were indicating a readiness to challenge the central government in Moscow over prices and delivery. They wanted better prices than the government was offering, or they would not sell. The government continued to opt, as it always would indeed had to, choosing guns over butter. The fist meets the Chaika first versus second economy. Furthermore, they, as well as all of the other farmers, wanted things to buy. Goods from the cities were simply not getting to the villages, or were coming in such small drips and drabs that nothing other than the idiosyncratic private market, i.e., the often illegal, always present, second economy, could be created for them. They wanted the foreign market opened up for selling and buying whatever they wished to sell and for buying whatever they wished to import. Putting the international law of value of the capitalist world order back to work in the Soviet Union would have destroyed the government's rationing and price control system, especially the way in which it bought and sold agricultural produce, as we have studied above. It probably would undo the socialist accomplishments everywhere else as well, including in industrial production. What little capital the government had for industrial investment had to go to heavy and medium industry to support the fledgling agricultural machinery market, the auto and truck transportation needs of the nation, and the overwhelming needs of the military. The latter meant little official consumer industrial production occurred, and even less of what was officially produced got beyond the urban market. This inability of the legal economy, i.e., the first economy, to provide homegrown industrial products to the countryside in sufficient amounts was the Achilles heel in the Bolshevik agricultural NEP. The kulaks were taking advantage and would continue to exploit this terrible weakness in order to gain their objective. Their overriding objective was not to get a Coleman lantern-type Primus, stove or burner, from Leningrad. Rather, they wanted to set the market price for their goods wherever they liked, and then to get that price paid by whomever, including and especially the government. The kulak-dominated first and second agricultural economies gave the kulaks the ability to strangle the Bolsheviks eventually, if not immediately. And these rich farmers were not responsive at all to the party's call for patriotic support of the effort to industrialize the nation, by which the party leadership meant larger voluntary contributions from the farmers' stores of grain so the government could continue to be able to buy all the factories and equipment it needed to carry out its industrialization program. To tame the second economy, one had to break the class back of its existence and completely reformulate the first economy. This meant eliminating the capitalist class in the countryside altogether, and putting the landless agricultural workers and poor farmers in command in alliance with those among the middle farmers who would support them. To do this, the fist would have to meet the Chaika in open confrontation and combat. On August 1, 1928, forced collectivization really got underway. That collectivization began over the entire broad expanse of the Soviet agricultural regions virtually at the same time. Although it would take nearly the entire 4 years and 3 months of the first 5-year plan to see 100% of the agricultural productive land area of the USSR completely collectivized. A broad-based spectrum of party volunteers, students, and young pioneers from the cities assisted the Chaika. Their task was to mobilize mass support in the villages, ensuring the poor farmers and landless agricultural workers a free hand in challenging the kulaks, and those among the middle farmers who were their supporters. These reactionary elements were to be dispossessed of virtually all their property. Most would be deported for 5 years to Siberia to begin again as common farmers. That class of relatively rich farmers, history had found guilty of virtually every crime against the masses, would now answer to the highest court, that of historical revenge. Second proletarian revolution now in the Soviet Union in 1926, the handwriting was on the wall, and something would have to be done quickly or the crisis would be upon us. This uncomfortable position of being cut up by both the inability to produce sufficient amounts of consumer goods as one blade, having chosen in favor of long-term industrialization, and the demand of kulak-led oppositionist farmers for higher prices for their grain, meat, and poultry as the other blade, was referred to by economists of the time as being in the scissors crisis. Not all farmers fell into the kulak-led trap, and most middle farmers vacillated. Poor farmers were pro-government, as were agricultural laborers. As we have seen in 1926, Stalin was firmly in the leadership saddle and had been for at least 5 years. In addition, by 1926 he had decided that to industrialize Russia, mechanize and modernize its agriculture, an entirely new approach would be required. It was not too hard to see what had to be done. However, the task was monumental in scope. The intensity that would be required to achieve success was unclear to all except Stalin. The boss intended on melting the scissors by liquidating the tailors. He gave them one last chance as the harvest for 1928 began to stand impressively in the fields, with a special trip where he hoped to convince his opponents of the importance of conforming to the government's agricultural program. They refused, often insulting Bolshevism in the process. Anticipating an unreconstructed Kulak capitalist-led peasantry, Stalin had begun his counter-moves in the latter half of 1927, and these had been speeded up in 1928 until his final tour of the countryside in August. Then it became apparent he was ready to drop all pretenses and go for broke and forced collectivization of the entire farming population of the Soviet Union. The party would mobilize volunteers to go to the countryside, but the main instrument of social policy would be the Chaika. Lenin's wisdom proved itself in the event, for without this sword and shield of the proletarian revolution, we would have failed in our agricultural policy. Up and until this time, the Soviet experience with forced collection of agricultural and animal husbandry products had been extensive but of mixed quality and results. Most of it acquired during the Civil War. Since then, there had been only occasional need to resort to force to collect what the government was due. That is until the winter of 1927 to 1928, when Stalin backed emergency collection measures to counteract the Kulak withholding of grain reserves, which we reviewed in Stalin's own July words above. Then in the spring of 1928, the government was able to relax these forceful collections and allow the planting to proceed apace and the market economy to work unimpeded. The beginning of the great change would come after this fall's harvest. 1928, Stalin takes over agriculture again. The struggle began in August 1928. This time the party would take the farmers in hand the way it had wanted to ever since the farmers had taken the party in hand and forced the restoration of a legal, market, agricultural first economy in 1921. This time the party was prepared internally to pursue the task to the end. It had just a man at its head, Joseph Stalin, to see the mission would be accomplished, no matter what the cost. This struggle to force the farmers into cooperatives and collectives was the greatest war the Bolsheviks ever had to fight until World War II. Middle peasants will snap to attention. The agricultural half of the Stalinist solution moved along on time, or beat the schedule established in the end by the boss himself, who constantly pushed his planners to set higher production goals. The party began the wholesale use of volunteers along with Chekists to remove the rich farmers, kulaks, from the equation. As Molotov put it, and to paraphrase, the removal wholesale of the kulaks physically from the countryside forever will make the middle peasantry snap to attention. Kulaks were specifically not allowed to participate in coups or collective farms because of their class backgrounds. As Stalin said, to paraphrase, these persons as individuals were perhaps guilty of little themselves, but they are from a class guilty of every crime against humanity imaginable, and will accordingly be required to pay the price. The price was often deportation. Trainloads after trainload of Kulak families were deported for 5-year terms of exile to virgin areas of Siberia and Central Asia, to begin again, this time as common farmers. Regional bosses, the new disgruntled. However, while he was liquidating the power of the Kulaks as a class, it was also true within the party that Stalin lost support, over the years of the first plan, among his bureaucrats. Why? Because the societal contradictions created by the pace of the Stalinist solution were often enormous. As you may have surmised, these problems required a heavy government and state hand to see that they did not resolve incorrectly. Deportation. Just one example was deportation. Deportation disrupted social life throughout the agricultural regions. All of this dislocation interfered with the regional bosses' opportunities to meet their production schedules. One principal reason was that regional industrial bosses had always been able to rely on second economy privateers to marshal needed extra labor. This they had done in the same way that capitalists in the USA can go to cheap labor providers for Mexican immigrant day laborers. These minor privateer capitalists were no longer in business because the labor they had had access to was now in the collective farms or deported. Thus, much of the second economy simply disappeared too. Furthermore, the production targets for industry and collective farms were so high they often made compliance seemingly impossible for either workers or managers. Yet the boss would not listen to his managers' pleas and increasingly found their protests to be indications of subversive counter-revolutionary sentiments, and accordingly they shut up. Why did Stalin's solution work? 1. It gave the Russians something they absolutely had to have if they were to survive against the coming imperialist anti-communist war, i.e., a modern industrial infrastructure. And it worked because 2. Soviet workers were willing to make the great sacrifices necessary to make the socialist dream a reality. And 3. 4. It worked because Soviet managers realized that their health, lives, as well as their jobs and pensions were on the line should they fail to do as they were told. It worked because the remaining farming families all over the Soviet Union accepted the inevitable and got down to work as proletarianized agricultural workers, with some private plots to cultivate in their spare time. 5. It worked because enthusiastic communist youth from the cities went to the countryside to agitate and propagandize in favor of the Great Turn. Wrath of the bosses. But Stalin would eventually have to face the wrath of the newly disgruntled regional bosses. That confrontation came in January 1934 at the Congress of Victors. We shall return to this inevitable confrontation below. Inside snapshot winding down MOCR Spring 1928 Government's Permanence and Foreign Investment. Sitting at his Staraya Street office desk, Stalin was working on a mountain of papers when Poskrebyshev announced the presence of two top Chekists. Stalin motioned for them to be seated in front of him as he continued working. Koba, I have some bad news, I'm afraid. Speaking was Comrade Vyacheslav Menzinsky, who had stepped in to fill the hole left by Felix Dzerzhinsk's untimely passing. What is it? The MOCRists have escaped. See Chapter 10 for a description of the MOCR Roach Motel and its real life. Norman Bates, Management. How did that happen? I'm not sure, but it looks like the top guys figured it out somehow, because out of nowhere they put out the warning. Overnight everyone in the MOCR ran for the frontiers. So at the moment, all of the organized white subversives have either fled the country or are in our hands. Exactly, don't worry about it. Chaika boss Menzinsky was shocked. He had expected Stalin to have a fit. Instead, he seemed almost happy about it. You're not mad? Menzinsky commented rather than asked. Stalin stopped working, looking up to address his guests. Not at all, I think this is best. After all, the party and the country are well aware of the danger posed by foreign capitalists on the march against us again. The Shakti case proved it to them. The 15th Congress confirmed this fact as part of the general line. Now, we need to give foreign capital the opposite impression. As a matter of fact, I think I mentioned something like that to you and Beria just a week ago, did I not? Yes, actually, I thought you were joking when you said I wish they would just get smart and get lost so we can move on. But I guess we got lucky. Of course we did. After all, we are the ones who have been saying we are weak, surrounded, in danger of being overthrown. That doesn't do much for instilling confidence in foreign investors, does it? Right now, Ford declines to build our automobile complex because frankly they have no confidence we will last long enough to produce a profit for them. I will get their equipment, but I am going to have to buy it in cash up front so they get their profit now. Anyway, you guys have a lot more important things going on right now, especially in the Economic Directorate, than a bunch of pathetic Tsarist conspirators, and you are doing great work. The international capitalists do not know anything about our congresses, and even if they do read something, they do not understand what they read. So you keep up what you are doing and play down the foreign danger, as far as anything we let out to the capitalist world, all right? In other words, they should think. Because you privately tell them so, we are beyond all internal danger. That. We are quite strong, absolutely credit-worthy, having the best credit rating of any European nation, and determined to industrialize. At fair prices, of course, no matter what the cost. And to prove it, we are not even looking for the MOCRists. We wish them well in skulking around European fleshpots and acting as doormen at the new George V Hotel. Opened in 1928, in Paris. That is what the foreign capitalists and their banks need to have as their new view of the new Soviet Union, their new view of us in the Soviet leadership, and our absolute self-confidence. Yes, Koba. I agree. And, as you say, the monarchists would have been a waste of a lot of our agents' time had we arrested them. They are nothing. I need our agents in other areas. As usual, you have seen straight to the heart of the matter, Koba. Anything else? No, Koba, and thank you for your time. Any time, comrade, especially for you and your assistant here, Comrade Yagoda, is it not? Yes, sir. Thank you for remembering. I am well aware of the good work you have done, comrade, never doubt that. Yagoda had done much of the police work leading to the prosecutor's indictment in the Shakti case. Stalin ushered his guests to the door of his secretariat office. A rather sharp turn was underway. Only 4 months after the party had gone on record as seeing foreign invasion and accompanying subversion as its number one concern, its recently confirmed high leader was saying they were to eliminate that line altogether. As far as foreign consumption was concerned. After escorting Menzinsky and Yagoda to the door, and as his guests departed, Stalin shut the door. He returned to his desk and, seated, picked up a dedicated phone. As the secretary answered, he said, "Tell your boss to come in, please." Moments later, Beria entered. "Yes, Koba. I see Menzinsky was here." "Well done, Lav. Mesh is as loyal as an old hunting dog, but he is awfully dense. I am a little concerned about the future of the Chaika. What do you think?" "I think now that this thing is done, I need to get back to Georgia." "All right, but think about the Chaika's leadership and let me know if you come up with any good ideas." 1929 to 1930 Stalin takes over industrial and military planning. In 1918, the Red Army Officer Corps had divided into Bolshevik officers and former Tsarist officers. From 1923 until 1928, the Soviet government likewise divided into Bolshevik bureaucrats and bourgeois specialist bureaucrats. Therefore, despite 5 major agencies working on planning, there was in the period 1923 to 1928 in effect 5 years of no plan. The Red Army had managed to win the war, and in the aftermath, the Bolsheviks won out over the Tsarist officers who died or were terminated. However, conditions did not permit such a peaceful transition in industry, and it took time to train the new generation of technocrats. By 1930, it became apparent to Stalin and his closest associates that they would have to directly take over the national planning themselves. Central to this takeover was the idea of having a series of 5-year plans with a series of goals to be accomplished in 5, 10, 15, and 20 years. 1930. The Molotov government in 1928, Stalin had stepped in as the party boss of his second revolution, the revolution from above, by taking command of the agricultural front, the forced mass collectivization. In 1929, he began taking complete Politburo and Central Committee control of the industrial front, including supportive infrastructure. The actual implementation required a new government. In 1930, Vyacheslav Vlad Molotov replaced Alexei Rykov as prime minister. This change also entailed Molotov taking the top spot as chair of the Defense Commission. Across the board, for his new cabinet of commissars and agency chiefs, Molotov brought in trusted and experienced old Bolsheviks. Some continued their previous responsibilities, to which were added new ones. For example, Sergo Ordzhonikidze, often called the perfect Bolshevik, who was the Red Army general who had liberated Georgia, continuing as the chair of NEC and now was given the new job as being commissar for heavy industry. Leonid Krasin, dead since November 1926, had had a top deputy, Alexander Tsayuripa, who took over international finance. Another Krasin protege, Gregory Grinko, stepped in to run the finance commissariat. Lenin's bank-robbing chief and longtime pre-October financial adjutant to Krasin, Maxim Litvinov, came in to take over foreign affairs and eventually would be the USSR's ambassador to the League of Nations. Nikolai Kuibyshev was the new chief of HQ, RZSTO. Valerian Kuibyshev took over as Gosplan boss. Kliment Voroshilov continued as boss of the Red Army and Navy and as war commissar, Frunze having died in 1925. Molotov's title changed to defense commissar. In 1934, Voroshilov would continue at this job until replaced in 1940 by old Bolshevik General Semyon Timoshenko, who was also promoted to marshal in May 1940. For more insight on this, I recommend Molotov's autobiography Molotov Remembers. By the end of that fateful year of 1930, Molotov's boss, Joseph Stalin, found himself as the boss not just of party, state, and government, but boss of what turned out to be the greatest and fastest industrialization of any country in the history of the world. Underlying all was a new recognition. Bourgeois versus old Bolshevik specialists contradiction resolved. The boss and his men had recognized that no matter how you cut it up, the pie of jobs available to the Soviet government was simply too small. You had to bake a much larger pie, in fact, many much larger pies. In economic terms, this was already underway. As the double and quadruple output of basic industries like electrical power, steel, coal, machine tool construction, factory construction of heavy and light machinery, etc. now underway resolved the problem in a natural evolutionary way. In other words, these were, fortunately, undertakings already decided. Therefore, this solved the problem of insufficient bureaucratic jobs to go around. It also would solve the problem of industrial inferiority vis-a-vis the capitalist countries who had our Soviet Union encircled, and the process had been sped up by the Shakti case. Its outcome being the decision to replace the endemic inherently treasonous class of bourgeois specialists as soon as possible. Now what exactly did the party's new government have to do? Taste of the problem. By 1929, it became apparent that the bureaucratic warfare and Byzantine politics of the existing system of managerial control had proven totally unfit for the demands now being placed upon it. No matter how much intervention had occurred from the center since, say, 1926, the bureaucrats continued to hide equipment, raw materials, suborned subcontractors, and even marshal private, second economy, sources of labor power. Experience had proven that only the closest, hands-on, diligent supervision of the commanding heights of new industrial projects, e.g., the foregoing mentioned Nizhny Novgorod auto truck plant and the undertaking mentioned below at Magnetic Mountain, could ensure that the goals and specifications of the 5-year plan were met. This meant that the boss himself and his best men had to take command. First, some of these bottlenecks need to be described. Nizhny Novgorod, and then Gorky. How did one go about the actual construction of a tractor or automobile plant in a planned economy? Let us take one example of how the nightmare of learning how to do it turned out, at the Nizhny Novgorod, NN, Gorky, automobile and truck plant. The first stage of plant construction cost the USSR $30 million US, cash paid upfront, to Henry Ford's company and calling for 2 phases of construction to build. 1. 2. An assembly plant in Russia with components now purchased from the US to be operational in 1929. A second phase where the Soviets would receive an entire manufacturing plant for A to Z, building 130,000 automobiles and trucks by 1930, constructed under one overall authority, the All-Union, Federal, Automobile and Tractor Manufacturing Association, VATO. Initially it was to be implemented by 2 other agencies, Metalostroy and Avitstroy, overseen by the 2 main planning agencies NEC, Vysenka, and STO. This division of agency implementation and oversight constantly resulted in conflicts between the 2 subcontractors and their overseers, and the resulting mess having to go to the party's highest authorities for resolution. Always this required intervention of the Politburo to resolve the problems. Yet, it would not be until the end of the second plan in 1937 before the projected 130,000 annual production rate was actually maintained on a regular basis. Real freedom of the press. We Bolsheviks believe, and believed then, in suppressing the capitalist press, now and forever. However, criticism from the party press over government activities, except during the war years, was always ongoing and intense. An excellent example can be seen by the way the press journal exposed the chaotic disgrace going on at the NN auto truck plant by the Soviet. For industrialization, za industrialization. Its correspondent in NN, Boris Agapov, wrote many of these articles over a 2-year period. The crisis in mid-January 1930, for industrialization, reported that all was not well at NN. VATO chiefs had been receiving glowing reports from NN since the project was announced a year earlier. In practice, the chiefs of Metalostroy and Avitstroy spent the first day of the January meeting screaming curses at each other, and it became apparent that little actual progress had been made at all. Only 10% of the needed amount of equipment and supplies was being received on a daily basis. Avitstroy had balked at paying the prices demanded by Metalostroy, that retaliated by putting its overload of demand from other concerns ahead of Avitstroy's orders. This mess was corrected right away, but the VATO bosses had to send special agents to handle the situation. Even then, the infighting simply shifted to other theaters of the industrial front, while the main lesson learned by local managers turned out to be improvisation. In March 1930, for example, confronting the planning failure of a 48 million brick shortfall, managers learned to get it some other way. In this case, buying out the supply of a second economy silicate factory nearby. The alternative was to face the consequences, which by now could include mandatory death sentences for failure to meet quotas. In April 1930, Avitstroy complained it had insufficient locomotive and truck transport to move supplies from the delivery yard to the construction sites. Again, the center had to send adjusters to get things squared away. Agapov did not hesitate to give his opinion, which was to get Metalostroy out of the picture altogether, and set up Avitstroy as the principal subcontractor for VATO at NN. This is what happened at the end of the summer, end of August, 1930, when the NEC reorganized everything under its new Politburo assigned troubleshooters Sergo Ordzhonikidze and Lazar Kaganovich. These 2 longtime Bolshevik leaders were sent to NN armed with the authority of the CC Politburo, and as the new chair and vice chair of the National Economic Council on September 10, 1930. Ordzhonikidze was simultaneously told to prepare to take over the now to be created Commissariat of Heavy Industry. These 2 finally got the mess under control at NN. But it would not be until November of the following year, 1931, that the first batch of Ford Model A automobiles and Ford Model A trucks began to roll off the production lines. In the meantime, there had been a host of serious problems not accounted for in the plan. In October 1930, for example, For Industrialization reported that the bureaucrats had failed to plan for the right amount of the right kind of alloyed steel. Neither Avitstroy nor Stahl, the steel supplier, had made plans to supply these needs, as they had hoped to import the steel they needed. Stahl had thus failed to even prepare the productive capacity for the right kind of steel. This meant unplanned expenses, time, and resources had to be made and appropriated to a special steel industry just to keep NN going on time. In retrospect, we can see clearly that the CC Politburo intervention via Ordzhonikidze and Kaganovich saved the situation. They brought with them in their September 10, 1930, takeover at NN a large staff of trusted and able cadre that 1. By the beginning of 1933, Ordzhonikidze could report to Stalin that annual production had been overfulfilled by 30%, with auto and truck units rolling off the lines at a rate of 130,000 vehicles per year. Maintaining that rate was another matter, but at least these desperately needed cars and trucks were being produced at home and no longer had to be imported. This lesson was not lost on the CC Politburo and its chiefs in the new Stalin government headed by Vyacheslav Molotov. Magnetic Mountain, Magnitogorsk. NN was a well-established Tsarist town and Bolshevik city. The party had a large and important apparatus on hand when the first plan leaders announced their choice of NN to be the center of the auto/truck industry. On the other hand, the party planners had also decided to build another, show city, in the wilderness, out of nothing on hand whatsoever. Magnitogorsk would be a major city, built largely in secret, on the eastern side of the extreme southwest Urals mountains on the Ural River in the Chelyabinsk Oblast of the RFSFR. There was at this locality a geologic anomaly, namely a mountain almost entirely made of iron. The river locale made it accessible to supply of whatever might be needed to develop this resource for the Soviet government. It would become the world's largest city devoted to iron and steel manufacturing, dwarfing Pittsburgh in size and extent. Joseph Stalin had learned of this mountain in his youth, and had climbed it, and had over the years consulted many geologists and engineers about the possibility of exploiting this resource. As many young people do, he had experimented with a magnetic compass while climbing and had seen how the compass went crazy in different directions according to where one happened to be at the moment. Now he would put that knowledge to work. Everything from Magnetic Mountain and its A to Z steel manufacturing complex at the center of a satellite of cities devoted to large-scale industrial manufacturing plants had to be imported to the chosen site and implanted into the virgin land. During the years of its construction, the 1930s, every attempt was made to jump ahead in social organization along lines which would serve as a model for a new socialist humanity. For a wonderful exposition of what Stalinist socialism could and did achieve, I recommend the book Magnetic Mountain, Stalinism as a Civilization, Stephen Corkin, 1995, University of California Press, Berkeley and Los Angeles. Great advances were made in the development of education from kindergarten to tertiary levels of university and technical institutes. Great advances were made in training working people to discuss daily events from the class struggle perspective to determine what a socialist course and/or perspective should look like on each of the many issues arising in Soviet life. At the same time, old ideas, some then contemporary Bolshevik ideas, were set aside in favor of publicly discussed and agreed upon modifications, as in the areas of marriage, divorce, and abortion. No area of cultural life was ignored as the buildings comprising Magnetic Mountain were constructed to house every area of social as well as technological life. 10 years is all we have. Suffice to say, we Bolsheviks prevailed again. Collectivization gave Stalin the agricultural produce he needed to sell at home and abroad, to come up with the cash to buy all the factories and machinery that the Soviet Union needed if his program to bring the USSR to modern capitalist levels within 10 years were to succeed. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this lag in 10 years. Either we do it or they crush us. This excerpt is taken from Stalin's speech to the Industrial Managers' Conference on February 4, 1931. Almost as importantly, Stalin had eliminated the class enemy on the land. These kulaks and their hangers-on had been the backbone of Russian capitalism, and now they were gone. The countryside was socialist and unified in political lockstep conformity with the Red government in Moscow. Although overall agricultural production was drastically reduced because of the sabotage of the kulaks, the portion the government received went way up. Kulaks were rich farmers. Kulak is the Russian word for fist. Originally, these were the local bosses the Tsar and the aristocrats used to keep the common farmers in line, thus the term fist. After the revolution, this class was reborn among the winners in the grab bag redistribution of 1917. If the Soviet government got 10% of the previous overall private farm output, that was a lot less than the 60% to 90% of the collective farm output the Soviet government now received. For the first time since the October Revolution in 1917, the Soviet government's treasury was permanently full of reliable revenue streams and had, if anything, in excess of cash. The Soviet government was no longer dependent upon the international capitalist marketplace for income. It could itself determine much about the nature of that market, making the international capitalist market dependent upon it, by withholding or releasing products such as grain as it desired to assure a given market price. Along with the sale of oil, timber, minerals, diamonds, furs, caviar and other exotic products, the government had stable, reliable income from multiple profit centers. Henceforth, the Soviet government would have all the cash it required to conform to the international capitalist insistence on being paid in cash up front. Accordingly, the Soviet government for the first time could demand and get credit, at least from merchant bankers, and the banking credit blockade had been broken. One merchant banker, Armand Hammer, describes some of his anecdotal experiences in this regard in his book Hammer, and I highly recommend this autobiography for your spare time reading. For Stalin, collectivization was a tremendous success. He had eliminated the class enemy on the land inside the USSR and gotten a permanent source of plainable income in the form of agricultural goods. The capitalist farmers had been brought to heel. The new Soviet farming class held its head high for the first time. The Soviet Union was now a financial power on the world scene. 1929 Evolution of Red Army Industrial Complex, getting the army modernized. Arming and equipping the Red Army had been the Bolsheviks' primary task from the earliest days of the revolution, as you have seen. This military build-up evolves through several distinct stages. 1. Initially, the Bolsheviks inherited what was left of the Tsarist army, which by January of 1918 was about 300,000 men. They had been equipped with small arms, rifles, pistols, produced in Russia in the arms factories of Kazan and Petrograd. We have traced the origin of large-scale rifle production in the early pages of Chapter 13, Robert Nobel in the Caucasus. Ongoing military factory construction had provided what the Tsar's army had come to rely upon. However, these factories never produced enough arms for all the Tsarist soldiers. This was a function of the A, B, C, 2. Low level of producibility inherent in these early factory installations and the huge numbers of farmer conscripts who were expected to pick up the rifle of dead comrades and use them as their own. Russian capitalists had been slow to invest in new and improved machinery in the arms factories because of the cost and because they had an already guaranteed Tsarist government contract for what they did produce. In the second stage, the Bolsheviks had to recapture lost arms factories and get them into production. Then they had to beef up rifle and pistol manufacturers everywhere, so that each soldier in this multi-million-man Red Army would have one. During the Civil War, 1918-1920, the War Commissar, Leon Trotsky, convinced the Germans to build more factories for him. He did this with large quantities of money spread liberally among the Wehrmacht general staff and the German government everywhere appropriate, while the war against Germany was still going on. From the German standpoint, this assistance would produce factories down the road and not have an effect on the war now, clearing the way for German bureaucrats and generals to make some money. With the coming of peace in the autumn of 1918, this German war factory construction, in the Soviet Republic, for everything from small arms to tanks and planes, really got underway. All this construction was also fueled by cash purchases financed from the wealth seized from the Tsarist ruling oligarchy and its church, or cash paid directly to Lenin from the Germans themselves. 3. 4. With the end of the Civil War and the coming of NEP, the Economic Directorate of the Cheka was given the primary task of securing what was needed from the surrounding hostile capitalist world. In order to build even more factories and to further beef up the standing T, O, and E of the Red Army. What slowed things down all along was the inadequacy of the Soviet industrial complex. It was not until 1931 that an industrial complex sufficient for the job imagined by Stalin and the Politburo was in existence. Some of the first examples of what could be done were military. The T-28 and T-34 tanks and the Sturmovik fighter bombers, as well as agricultural. We reviewed Stalin's emphasis on tractors above in his conversation with Richard Sorg and illustrated some problems with the automotive truck and other massive civil engineering installations. 5. The T-28 tank is another early and important proof of Soviet industrial progress with a military orientation under Stalin's plan. From the time Stalin took over the tank industry personally, that is to say January 1930, until that industry could turn out the best battle tanks in the world, was only 3 years, 1933. We have seen how that aspect of industrialization progressed, albeit after a rough start, from the standpoint of its number one customer, the Red Army. But first, cracking the whip crisis in the oil field. As the first plan got underway in August of 1928, it immediately became apparent that, despite initial reports from party cadre in charge of the Baku oil fields, there was an insufficient supply of oil coming northward. Stalin knew the oil field better than any Bolshevik, now that Krasin had passed away at the end of 1926, and he took emergency measures after a thorough investigation that autumn. In January 1929, Stalin notified oilfield managers that failure to meet their quotas of oil produced and any further falsification of dry holes as producing wells would result in mandatory and automatic death sentences. Schlumberger. Panic-stricken field engineers and middle-level management blamed second economy privateers for falsification of records and furthermore demanded they get the most modern French equipment to log wells prior to casing them. Stalin agreed, and the Schlumberger brothers were brought from France. They tried out their technique, newly invented, of running an electrical cable downhole and then withdrawing it on a spool in such a way that one end of the cable rubbed up against the open hole's sidewall. The other end of this armored insulated electrical cable was anchored to the ground on the surface. Differences in resistivity of an electrical current being run through this wire line told several things, including what kind of sedimentary layers of rock the wire line downhole was touching and what they contained. All sedimentary rocks downhole are wet, with oil, gas, and/or water. Luckily, for everyone involved, the Schlumberger brothers got better results in Baku than anywhere else in the world where they had tried. The technique. This, by the way, is the invention of modern wireline electrical downhole logging. It meant that engineers would not have to take their lives in their hands every time they had to make a decision about whether to case a well or not. Casing a well means running steel pipe into the well and then cementing that pipe to the surrounding formation. Stalin brought the Schlumberger family and their entire staff to Russia and under their supervision built factories to produce the equipment and technical schools to train Russian engineers. This made Russia the technically most modern oil-producing country in the world and the Schlumbergers the wealthiest family in France. It also allowed a tripling of Soviet oil production over the 4 years of the first five-year plan, 1928 to 1932. This made all the difference in the inevitable oil-based GNP Second World War now only a decade away. The Red Army always had plenty of fuel, as did Soviet industry. And Schlumberger has written a biography about her father and uncle in Baku pioneering the Soviet oil well logging industry, and I highly recommend it to you young cadre. After I had become an archaeologist, PhD 1974, and after my 1980 escape from Peru I also became a petroleum well logging engineer and wrote a textbook on the subject for NL Industries. Consequently, I have a special interest in this field of the most dangerous industrial occupation in the world, the oil field in all its facets. I discuss more of these well logging experiences in Volume 6 of the series Idaho Smith's Search for the Foundation entitled Third Crusade, Kindle Books. www.amazon.com www.amazon.com. Our free press again. Stalin takes over tank industry. December 1929. 1 year after the first plan began, in September 1929, there was a flurry of exposed reports in the pages of several military and industrial journals. The same muckraking campaign we have discussed concerning failures at Nizhny Novgorod had overtaken the Red Army itself. This time over the manufacture of tanks. The Politburo demanded an explanation. 3 months later, in December 1929, that explanation was provided in a report by independent investigators. Their scathing report concluded that the exposes of the newspaper were accurate, and it condemned the NEC, the Senka. Thus in December 1929, the Politburo delegated emergency authority, giving a blank check to a special team to get the tank industry up to planned standards immediately. War Commissar Klim Voroshilov later said of this report and Stalin's intervention. The Politburo, and mainly Comrade Stalin, demanded from us, take all measures, spend the money, even large amounts of money, run people to all corners of Europe and America, but get models, plans, bring in people, do everything possible and impossible in order to set up tank production here. War Commissar Kliment Voroshilov, 1932. BT, high speed, tank adopted by Red Army 1932, 6 varieties produced through 1939. Armor thickness. Bulletproof. Horsepower, 1932 version, 40 meters. Machine guns. T. 436.4 horsepower per ton, jumps 15. Wa .50 and .30 cal. Main gun. 45 and 76 mm KD-26 cannons, 1932-1939. Initial shell speed. Producibility. June 1941. Tracks. Any auto plant anytime 6,456 existed Caterpillar, and wheels. BT2, 1932, 400 horsepower M5 36.4 horsepower per ton, 3 times the HP of the best 1942 German tanks. The 1932 version could jump from 15 to 40 meters. Best tanks ever. By the beginning of the second plan in 1933, the most advanced tank in the world was the Soviet-manufactured high-speed, BT, tank. Technologically, it all began in the year 1931, when the Chaika got its hands on 2 of the most advanced Vickers tanks in the British T.O.N.E. Among many then advanced features these tanks featured, 1. Independent suspension of the wheels driving the treads on the tanks, and this made them much more adaptable to a variety of land surfaces, and allowed tanks with them to be built closer to the ground, with a resulting low silhouette. Soviet copies would have this suspension plus other features such as 2. Much heavier cannon and 3. Effectively thicker, slanted, armor. 1931 was also the year the Chaika bought 2 of U.S. manufacturer George Walter Christie's tanks, for cash under the table, and phony shipping papers as tractors, to a tractor end user in Odessa. No other army in the world. Then the Red Army was paying any attention to Mr. Christie's work, including the U.S. Army, so he was cash short. In fact, the Russians saved him from bankruptcy. 4. Christie's tanks had replaced the leaf spring system of independent wheel suspension with a new form, which allowed his tanks to go at much higher speeds with a lower profile. In 1932 and 1933, the end of the first plan and the beginning of the second. Across the board, Soviet tanks of three classes were emerging as qualitatively superior to any of the tanks of the capitalist nations. The most important of these was the T-28. These first newly designed main battle tanks were produced in three major Soviet factory complexes. They were so simple in design as to be buildable in any autoworks factory. Thus, they were also produced in secret in several of the new five-year plan arms factories behind the Urals. They became available in large numbers, more than the rest of the world's tank forces combined, in 1934. The T-28s were by far the best tanks in Europe as of 1933. The next question became, can we produce enough of the right types to ensure our victory in the inevitable coming World War? T-28 tank series. In 1933, the Red Army adopted these new T-28 tanks as its main battle tank, backed up by a slightly smaller tank and a considerably heavier one. Thus, that all three principal armor attack tactics could be employed in a single battle. In 1937, the T-28 gave way to the then ultramodern T-34 design as the new main battle tank. The T-28 dropped down to serving the function of mass armor attack primarily in support of the T-34 vanguards along with the other lighter tanks. However, when compared to the German Panzer series, the T-28 was always an overmatch for them. The T-34s absolutely commanded any battlefield against any German tanks once they took the field, so for purposes of comparison T-34s are far too advanced to be comparable to Panzers. The battlefield difference in everyday boxing terms is the difference between a heavyweight fighter and a middleweight. Therefore, for comparable statistics we should compare T-28s to German Panzers. At the time, these were the only serious contenders in the armor world. In 1937, all T-28s were made submersible to a depth of 4.5 meters through a river over half a mile wide with a downstream force of 1 meter per second or less. The Soviet Union has a total of 21,100 battle tanks, of all classes, ready for action. September 1, 1939. Nazis invade Poland. T-34 is main battle tank. On December 19, 1939. Red Armor liquidates Nazi armor. Kursk, July 5 to 13, 1943. From September 1, 1939, until the day the Second World War began for us, June 22, 1941, the Red Army was equipped with a total of 1,363 of these, best ever, T-34 tanks. Within 6 months of war's beginning, our factories were kicking out 35 per day or 1050 per month. Stalin had hoped to delay this war another year, at least, which would have given him at least another 12,600, probably more. This in itself might well have prevented the Nazi attack or redirected it elsewhere. Our tank production got right back on schedule in 1942, so that by the Battle of Kursk in early July 1943 the Red Army could literally swamp the attacking Nazi Kremlin and liquidate it, as we did. See Great Tank Battles, the Battle of Kursk, Parts 1 and 2 Northern and Southern on DVD. T-34. T-34 Tank Series. Orlov and Stalin, the dynamic duo after the fascist army officers rising in Spain, July 17, 1936, Stalin decided to intervene, as we shall see, chapter 16 below. Then the Spanish Civil War produced the long-awaited combat observational specifications of performance, armament, armor, reliability and producibility the Soviet government needed. These were channeled from Alexander Orlov in Spain directly to Joseph Stalin. The boss saw to it that the Soviet engineers in the major show industrial cities, including the secret ones being constructed behind the Urals, immediately incorporated them in the newly emerging, best ever, T-34 tank. Joseph Stalin had given these specialist engineers the exclusive responsibility for improving the main Soviet battle tank. Therefore, in 1937, the first of the perfected tanks, the T-34, in its prototype combat-tested, new and improved form was coming off the secret military production lines. These T-34 tanks featured slanted armor, which effectively doubled the amount of steel an incoming projectile had to penetrate in order to kill the tank crew, but at half the weight of the German tanks. This made the T-34s the fastest tanks in the world, which combined with their heavy guns, and Christie-type independently suspended wheels driving the treads, created our de facto invincible main battle tank. Stalin's tanks win the war for us. Stalin went on to build T-34s at an annual rate of over 40,000. So that by the end of January 1944, when the finalized version came online in large numbers, the Red Army had the best and greatest number of tanks in the entire world. Over 100,000 T-34s by the war's end in May 1945. The Stalin tanks, T-34s, 1942-43 versions and heavy KZs, dealt the final death blow to the Germans at Stalingrad and Kursk. And in each of the ever-increasing number of large-scale battles that forced the Germans back to Berlin in less than 2 years after the 8-day Battle of the Kursk salient, July 5 to 13, 1943. See Great Tank Battles, The Battle of Kursk, Parts 1 and 2 on YouTube for the details of the Battle of the Kursk salient. Military writers describe this nearly 2-year-long Operation Bagration as the greatest military success story in world history. Sturmovik fighter bomber. Air power was part of the army in all the advanced countries of the time. Of equal importance to Stalin and his planners to the land main battle tank, T-34 Stalin tank, for the Red Army, was the warplane called Sturmovik, Ilyushin II, IL-2. The Sturmovik was made of metal and wood. The main cabin and engine-bearing fuselage was a one-piece steel unit, made of such powerful defensive armor it was virtually impervious to bullets other than those fired by the very largest cannons. The Sturmovik's rear assembly and rear fuselage was made of wood, which made up in weight for the heavy armoring of the personnel carrying frontal steel assembly. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing so that they too were impervious to being blown up by the ignition of the gasoline fumes that would otherwise be in the partially empty tanks in combat. The end of World War II witnessed the Red Army with over 42,000 Sturmovik air tanks. They were by far the best warplane of any nation during that great conflict. They ensured the Red Army of control of the air and of the battle on the ground. Spanish Civil War gives Ilyushin flying tank crash production gives us enough to win the war in early 1938. The Spanish Civil War statistics and insights gained in the air war over Spanish battlefields led Stalin to bring Sergei Ilyushin and his Central Design Bureau to Moscow at Plant 39, now the forefront in aircraft production. Ilyushin had invented what was called the Sturmovik flying tank as his idea of an advanced ground attack fighter bomber. With Orlov's battle stats and Stalin's support, he had all the funding necessary to build and test these flying tanks and go over immediately to mass production. These fighter bombers would be built in plants all over the Soviet Union. Prototypes flew against the Japanese at Kokkinjioil, and the first regular Sturmovik shipments reached the Red Army 1 month before World War II began for us in May of 1941. In June 1941 we had only 249 of these on hand in Red Army units, so a great effort had to be made to get the huge number we would need to win the war. Beginning with the counterattacks at Moscow and Stalingrad, December 6, 1941 and November 19, 1942. The pace 5 and 4 in 1931, the first plan's third year, Stalin decided to wrap it up. That plan was in shreds compared to its structure at the beginning. The slogan, 5 years and 4, or simply 5 and 4, spread overnight across the country. Little children ran through their playgrounds that day singing, 5 and 4, 5 and 4. Stalin then kicked off the second 5-year plan a little over a year early. The first plan wrapped up its loose ends after a total lifespan of 4 years and 3 months. This time, with the second plan, the boss and his plan commissars had a solid grip on the mechanics of central planning and forecasting. Furthermore, despite the chaos of the first plan years, the errors and disasters, when it was all said and done there had been tremendous infrastructural progress. In heavy industry, machine tools, heavy and light machinery manufactures, as well as electricity production and oil and gas exploitation. However, on the question of pace, Stalin was persevering. The boss seemed to insist always on the hardest way to go. Why? To maximize the speed and scope of agricultural collectivization mechanization and to assure the absolute maximum rapidity in the construction of power, steel, machine tool, heavy and light manufacturing, chemical and fuel industries. The pace also became a way of keeping potential opposition from solidifying around anything. By the time a few managers might succeed in getting the Central Committee to grant an audience, the entire equation would have changed. As millions more workers were sent to tackle new targets, e.g., hydroelectric power construction, river linking canals, behind the Urals coal mines and steel industries, and the issues of the day had changed completely. Whatever ill-thought-out practical events had precipitated the manager's audience were now ancient history, compared to the new problems emerging by the increasing demands of the boss to increase the rate of collectivization to 100%. Pour steel before the walls and roof of the factory are finished. Decrease dry holes in the oil fields to 0. Factories and mines to 24-hour production days. And oh, by the way, this is now 7 days a week. Alternatively, in the experimental 5-week month, 6-day week, every day of the week. Opposition within the party was there and growing. It was there and growing because the pace demanded by Stalin was oppressive. Not only in hours worked but under conditions far worse than might have been tolerated by workers from capitalist bosses. Yet, Soviet labor proved loyal to Stalin and conformed. In other words, although the pace was oppressive, Soviet labor concluded that what they were gaining made it worthwhile. Not the least reason for this conformity, and the belief in it, was the 24-hour-a-day propaganda campaign. A campaign in the arts including motion pictures, the radio, the press, and ad hoc committees created everywhere to bring every artist in the country into the campaign to build a new socialist motherland with posters and graffiti. Trotsky attacked Stalinism in practice. It was on the question of pace, however, that Trotsky made a principled point of attack against Stalin. Beginning from his 4-year-long exile base on the island of Principe, off the Istanbul, Turkey coast, and continuing throughout the first 5-year plan, Trotsky had kept up a drumbeat attack on the Stalinists for the forced pace of the mechanization of collectivized agriculture, and the forced installation of everything. The new steel industry, the hydroelectric, machine tool, and massive automotive complexes arising literally from the bare earth all over the Soviet Union, as that magnetic mountain. Stalin could have stopped Trotsky cold, any time he wished. Why did he let him continue his ongoing assault against everything he was doing, building, dreaming? One must consider the possibility that Stalin found Trotsky's nearby treason to be useful in his political campaign at home to silence the opposition. Trotsky could not be a very worthy conspirator against the USSR after all unless he was alive and shooting off his mouth. Then it would be quite reasonable to jump to agreement with the Comintern line that Trotsky as a man of action would naturally be actively organizing all kinds of uprisings and conspiracies against his nemesis. As Stalin unfolded the trial of the Trotskyite Zinovieite opposition for the murder of Kirov in June 1936, it became apparent the central issue was going to be sabotage of the pace of the 5-year plans. In this limited way, the prosecutors were right. Zinoviev and Trotsky had publicly opposed the pace and made that opposition the center of their political opposition. Whatever Trotsky, Zinoviev et thought they had been doing with regard to Kirov, the real effect had been to set themselves up to be the principal targets of the most recent Chaika prosecutorial drama. I suspect these two so disrespected Stalin's intelligence, they never saw they were walking away into the sunset of political oblivion. However, that may have been, objective observers within the party could see the real targets were going to be anyone with a history of objecting, even quietly, to the pace set by the boss. Anywhere, anytime, for any reason he might consider sufficient at the moment. Smart bureaucrats, who could duck for cover and conform to the Chaika prosecutorial drama might seem unusual, but those of you familiar with the modern history of Russian literature will see some obvious historiography in the way the trial writers and choreographers worked. The point is the specifics of the drama were nothing beyond the central point of the stupidity of opposition to the most rapid pace humanly possible in industrial and agricultural and infrastructural, not to mention military production, which was the social structural point of the entire trial. It is not our job, in this textbook, to make a moral or ethical judgment on these developments. Prosecutions are often notoriously unfair in all countries. As I can testify from personal experience having dealt with the totally corrupt U.S. federal prosecutors and their cops. It is our job to reconstruct what happened so we can accurately understand what was going on in reality. For more on my experience with unfair prosecutions, I recommend my book Third Crusade at Kindle Books. www.amazon.com. www.amazon.com 1935 Alexei Stakhanov, hero of socialist labor. As the Congress of Victors concluded in January 1934, Comrade Stalin then proceeded to explain how the pace could be stepped up. The proof that production could be stepped up to seemingly fantastic levels came the next year, 1935. Thanks to the socialist dedication of miners led by Comrade Alexei Gregory Stakhanov, who had increased coal production by seemingly incredible amounts on their individual shifts. Stakhanov himself was a highly motivated communist jackhammer operator in a mine in the Donbass, Donetsk basin of the eastern Ukraine region, whom the local press had reported had produced 102 tons of coal in 5 hours and 45 minutes, which was 14 times his quota. Stalin read about him and his work, and the work of his team, and saw the obvious potential in stimulating the working class with this proof of what they could do when sufficiently motivated. Gregory Stakhanov also served as a brilliant proof that the old bourgeois specialists who had been sabotaging the Soviet economy in their foolish hope that the Soviet system would fail, could themselves be defeated. Thus, anti-Soviet plotters, as for example those who had dominated the coal capital of the Donbass at Shakhty, had failed miserably at the hands of Donbass coal miners. The Stakhanovite movement began as a new stage of the Second Five-Year Plan. Socialist competition. In 1935. Competition. The Stakhanovite movement was named after Alexei Stakhanov, who had mined 102 tons of coal in less than 6 hours, 14 times his quota. However, his record would soon be broken by his followers. On February 1, 1936, it was reported that Izotov had mined 607 tons of coal in a single shift. Nikita. The Stakhanovite movement, supported and led by the CPSU soon spread over other industries of the Soviet Union. The initiators of the movement were Alexander Bizygin, automobile industry; Nikolai Smetana, industry; Shu, Yevdokia and Maria Vinogradov, textile industry. I. Gudov. Machine tool. Pyotr Krivonos. Industry V. S. Musinski, timber industry. Railroad. Pasha Angelina. Tractor. Maria Demchenko. Glorified as the first Soviet woman to operate a tractor, Konstantin Borin, and agriculture, and many others. On November 14 to 17, 1935, the first all-union, federal, Stakhanovite conference took place at the Kremlin, which emphasized the outstanding role of the Stakhanovite movement in socialist reconstruction of national economy. In December 1935, the Plenum, Central Committee, All-Union Communist Party Bolsheviks, full meeting of specifically discussed the aspects of developing industry and transport system in light of the Stakhanovite movement. The resolution of the plenum said, "The Stakhanovite movement means organizing labor in a new fashion, rationalizing technologic processes, correct division of labor, liberating qualified workers from secondary spade work, improving workplace, providing rapid growth for labor productivity, and securing significant increase of workers' salaries." In accordance with the decisions of the plenum, the Soviets organized a wide network of industrial training and created special courses for foremen of socialist labor. In 1936, a number of industrial and technical conferences revised the projected production capacities of different industries and increased their outputs. They also introduced the Stakhanovite competitions within factories and plants, broken down into periods of 5 days, Pyatynevka, 10 days, Dekada, and 30 days, Meziakniki. The factory management would often create the Stakhanovite brigades or departments, which reached a stable higher collective output. Female Stakhanovites were rarer than male, but a quarter of all trade union women were designated as norm-breaking. A preponderance of rural Stakhanovites were women, as milkmaids, calf tenders, and field workers. From Wikipedia. With Stakhanovism, Stalin had the solution to increasing the pace, which the regional party bosses at the January 1934 Congress of Victors already considered oppressive if not impossible. They would soon be replaced along with all those faint-hearted who had supported them. Total speed up on the job advocated and enforced by trade unions was Stalin's answer. The opposition was completely cowed. In fact, all opposition was now dead, sometimes literally, not just politically. Just to be sure, there was more trials, public and en camera. The summer soldier Bolsheviks who had exposed themselves at the Congress of Victors would be weeded out, and unity achieved again for the Workers' Vanguard Party. 1937 Reorganizing the military and the final phase of the Stalin purge of the party government state apparatus in preparation for the next phase of the worldwide class war featured many generals from the old days replaced by a new generation of officers. It was this new generation of officers who would win the coming World War II for Stalin. Chief in importance among the newly emerging general class was George Zhukov, who was given command of the Soviet Far East Military District. You will recall when, in this textbook, CH10, we last saw Zhukov, he had just begun as a cavalry sergeant at Lwów and Warsaw in 1920. After service as a private soldier in the Konarmia, 1st Red Cavalry. The military and military-industrial complex purge of 1937 to 1938 brought critical war industries, especially in aviation, up to the most modern par then in existence. From the Central Design Bureau Ilyushin, headquarters in Moscow, came what Stalin was demanding. It turned out to be the most important air weapon of the Second World War. The Ilyushin II, IL-2, or Sturmovik, tank buster. This air tank ground attack aircraft, what is called a fighter bomber in U.S. parlance, along with the T-34 tank. It was qualitatively the best tank by all historian accounts of all countries of the entire Second World War. Both came from the early Soviet lead in tank and aircraft design, Spanish Civil War experience, and the military and military-industrial complex purge reorganization that began in 1937. The Sturmovik was a mass-producible heavily armored fighter bomber, especially designed to fly low to the ground for close air support to attacking infantry and armor. It could fly slow enough to do the job on the ground and fast enough to drive off the best German fighters. Imagine a land tank with wings coming at you at 100 feet off the ground, firing heavy cannon and .50 cal machine guns and then dropping one of a hell of a bomb. Worst of all, your bullets have no effect. Heavy armor and self-sealing gasoline tanks made the Sturmovik seemingly invincible as Nazi warplanes and anti-aircraft ground fire found their bullets bouncing off or seemingly having no effect. This weapon was designed and produced according to specifications provided to Soviet industry from Spain-based Alexander Orlov and placed into industrial action by Joseph Stalin. In other words, these specifications were a direct result of combat experience in Spain. The Sturmovik is the air tank, often called flying tank. Stalin was fighting with Tukhachevsky about wanting 20,000 of these. Probably more than any other one thing, it was this single critical issue, which led to the latter's death. Tukhachevsky wanted to build instead a heavy bomber fleet to take the war directly to Nazi Germany in a first strike. For an upside-down interpretation of this fight, see the book The Chief Culprit by Viktor Suvorov, 2008, U.S. Naval Academy Press, Annapolis. However, the personal historical dislike we know Stalin had for Tukhachevsky should not be underestimated in the way the Tukhachevsky affair played out. Stalin would tolerate Kalinin's alcoholism, barely, because of their old times together. I think for the same reason, their mutual historical experiences, he would cut Tukhachevsky no slack. The T-34 Stalin tanks were also designed based on Spanish Civil War experience. It had slanted armor that doubled the amount of steel an enemy shell had to penetrate, while giving the Red tanks a heavier punch at half the Panzer weight. Thus, at half the weight of German tanks, the T-34s were very fast, safer with diesel as opposed to gasoline engines, better protected, and with the additional plus of being heavily armed with bigger cannons than any of the Nazi tanks. These changes, perfected in personnel and equipment, appeared as the 1938 Red Army Field Manual theory of deep battle. They took on new and even greater importance, because the theory and method of what the Germans would call blitzkrieg could actually be implemented. The Germans originally learned blitzkrieg from the Red Army instructions of General Tukhachevsky during the early Rapallo years. The new weapons provided our side with the best tank and best close-air ground attack warplane of the entire coming World War II, regardless of side. In short, the military changes won the war for us. By June of 1941, the Red Army was not only the biggest army in the world, it had 3 times as many tanks and twice as many warplanes as the rest of the world combined. This overwhelming numerical superiority, combined with Stalin's construction of the vast coal steel machine tool tank and aircraft factory construction behind the Urals, saved socialism when the inevitable imperialist war against the Soviet Union began. The Tukhachevsky affair. Every single aspect of this modern war capability came as a direct result of the 5-year plans and everything they entailed. Both the historians of the US imperialists and the Trotskyists are allergic to the truth in this matter for obvious reasons. This is why they have given you a totally arbitrary, one-sided, and always false version of the particular event known in socialist scholarship as the Tukhachevsky affair, meaning the decision in 1937 to arrest Marshal Tukhachevsky and associates and execute them. We will pursue this topic in depth below in our discussion of World War II in Chapter 13. The pace For Stalin, pace was a question upon which compromise was not possible. Not any real compromise. For example, at the end of the 1929 to 1930 harvest and government collection, dislocations because of the pace of the forced collectivization had forced a temporary compromise to come from Stalin. Stalin blamed those underneath him for pushing the pace too far and too fast. In his Pravda article, Dizzy with Success, on March 2, 1930, see Marxist Internet Archive for the full document, Stalin seemed to be coming to the defense of the mass of the now pathetic capitalist farmers. However, after the grain was in 1930, the moment the party and police were back in the saddle, the pace was pushed even faster. And by whom? By the boss himself. Experience. Why? Because Stalin had learned, as a 14-year-old boy in Georgia, the way to win, organizing strikes and robbing banks, was to keep moving so fast that the police could never catch you. It kept him out of jail for years. See Simon Montefiore's 2007 biography Young Stalin. In the 1904 to 1905 War and Revolution, he learned the way to beat the Tsar was to keep events moving in front of him, and out of control. Stalin found during the Civil War, 1918 to 1920, the way to win was to move troops quickly from one part of the Soviet Republic to another part using trains and trucks, relying on the telegraph and telephones as opposed to courier dispatches of old cavalry and dragoons, mounted infantry. It is Trotsky's Red Train which military historians never seem to fail to use as an illustration when commenting on Bolshevism's commitment to modernity in warfare. However, it was Stalin who used the railroads more than any other of the 3 supreme commanders. By the end of 1918, November 30th, the party declared the 3 supreme commanders to be Stalin, Lenin, and Trotsky. And on that date Pravda announced the trio as the highest authority triumvirate leading the Red Army in what the party now called the Soviet Republic as a military camp. At the same time, Stalin was shrewd enough to see the superiority of Buttonese cavalry when fast and hard-hitting movement was what was needed. Several times he had shown his ability to move a powerful, Buttonese First Red Cavalry army across a vast distance and go right off the march and into combat against superior white or foreign, e.g. English, French, Polish, forces, dealing them death and total destruction. It was the combination of these successes of Stalin's in the Civil War, which gave him a much-deserved military reputation among his peers. Stalin's use of working-class Bolshevik regular and political officers gained him political support in the officer class, at least among the Bolshevik portion. Stalin learned during the aftermath of the Civil War how important it was to move extremely fast against the opposition. Whether that opposition came in the form of revolting would-be capitalist farmers in Tambov, where General Tukhachevsky's quick application of poison gas on rebel peasant forces brought about their demise, or against mutinous sailors at Kronstadt, where Trotsky led an immediate attack by the party members in Congress in Petrograd along with available Red Army forces, liquidating the mutiny before it could gain support. See Chapter 10 for the full story. Such potentially lethal opposition could be kept isolated and thus overwhelmable by a rapid movement of superior forces against them. Leninist art of war: deep operations, deep battle. By this time, the idea of speed combined with deep probing armor thrusts backed up by close air support for superior infantry frontal assault was the basis for the new Soviet military doctrine known as deep operations. Simultaneously known as deep battle as in the 1936 Red Army Field Manual. This doctrine had as its first principle the use of deep behind-the-lines armor and air attacks to break up enemy formations before they could get their act together, and retreating formations before they could regain their footing. This is exactly the strategy Stalin used against the kulaks and other capitalist elements in the countryside. Deep battle and civil class struggle. In short, Stalin had learned the utility of speed and surgically applied overwhelming force in getting a decisive victory once you made up your mind about where you wanted to go. Stalin knew what he wanted in Russia: 1. A modernized and socialized, what should have been inherited, capitalist industrial base, and 2. An American agribusiness, socialized mechanized agriculture. It was for this reason Stalin did not compromise on the question of pace. He really could not without giving his opponents the breathing space they would need to organize against the man in control of the party, and its state and government. Nor could he reduce the pace if he really believed what he said. That the USSR had only a decade in which to prepare for the final imperialist world war the capitalists will inevitably unleash. Congress of Victors, wintertime with Stalin, January-February 1934. During the middle of January 1934, the build-up for the party's greatest congress since the death of Lenin, exactly a decade earlier, was well underway. For 2 weeks beginning January 26, the party's highest officials met in Moscow for the party's 17th Congress. The press was calling it the Congress of Victors. The victors of the Napoleonic Wars in Vienna, as the Soviet press frequently pointed out, held the last Congress of that name, in 1815. That time Russian troops backed up international reaction. This time in the winter of 1933 to 1934 Russian troops backed up the world's first workers' government. For Stalin the outcome was bittersweet. Why? Because while the Congress gave him the adulation he deserved for the great successes of the first five-year plan and okayed his decision to launch the second five-year plan over a year early, you will recall that discontent among the party brass was seething just below the surface. The party rank and file faithful may have been thrilled with the boss, but much of the brass felt terribly abused and insecure. One might say that, at the least, the brass was disgruntled. The victors agreed with Stalin's now famous summation speech, e.g., to paraphrase, the Soviet Union, which 5 years earlier had produced only 4 million tons of steel, now produced over 6 million tons of steel annually. The Soviet Union, which had the most primitive machine tool building industry, now had a massive and most modern one. The Soviet Union, which had the most primitive chemical industry, now had one adequate to the most modern demands. The Soviet Union, which had no aluminum industry, now had one. The Soviet Union, which had an uncertain supply of petroleum products, now had a permanent supply and transportation system of ships and pipelines. The Soviet Union, which had no hydroelectric power industry, now had one, including the soon-to-be completed greatest hydroelectric dam in the world. Stalin pointed out that in the 4 years from August 1928 through 1932, population in the urban areas had doubled from 16 to 31%. Within that figure, one had to take into account the rapid proletarianization of these cities, with the number of industrial workers jumping from 3,124,000 to 7,921,000. The number of women workers employed in the years of the first plan jumped from 2.795 million to 13.9 million, a jump within overall employment for women from 24% to 39% of the total workforce. By the end of the first plan, the number of workers beginning their industrial careers since 1926 had reached a level of 45 to 60% according to the specific industry. Industrial production overall had doubled within these 4 years. Not only had steel production increased over 50%, the production of coal jumped 100% from 35.4 million tons annually to 64.3 million tons annually. Electricity production to support industrial expansion had tripled, jumping from 5 million kilowatt-hours to 14 million kilowatt-hours. The list went on, and and everyone knew this was the bottom line. They had given Stalin what he wanted and had demanded, and when you stepped back and looked at the results of the past few years, you knew that the boss, for all of his seeming unrealistic demands and enforcement measures, had been right after all. Not unimportantly, that also meant he had saved their lives. For if the capitalists succeeded in their eventual inevitable world war against them, the party leaders and cadre would be hung along with their families and friends. Wrath of disgruntled bosses. On the other hand, the voting went heavily against Stalin where it counted. And this in a Congress organized by the man who had organized every Congress beginning in 1917. His regional bosses were extremely pissed off. The boss finally persevered in the vote count and in the formalities of leadership approval, but it was as close-run a thing as was possible in those days. Stalin had reason to see treason all around him, and this time within the party itself. The pace, too. Yes, the Congress of Victors was a tremendous success for the Russian party and for the international communist movement too, which saw what came out of the Congress as approval of Stalin's leadership. But quietly, at home, Stalin knew he would face significant opposition from within the party to his leadership. Opposition left over from these early years, as well as overcoming contradiction not even thought of at the moment. And the boss planned on stepping up the pace, as we have seen with our earlier discussion of Stakhanov and his revolutionary miners. Stalin names new class, classless intelligentsia. Stalin had to have managers, bureaucrats, to run the publicly owned means of production. He and the entire party leadership, since 1922, had gone about creating a new class that Stalin now called the classless intelligentsia. By the mid to late 1930s, there were over 10 million of them. Along with the industrial workers and the collective farms, this made the regime very stable. Even so, there was the ever-present potential threat posed by the government-tolerated second economy of private capitalists. However, as long as active oppositional elements were continuously weeded out by the secret proletarian police, the Stalinist socialist stage was permanent. Class struggle in nation, class struggle in party. Stalin, like all politicians, used pressure against his opposition. And there was an increasing amount of opposition from big regional party bosses commanding billions of rubles in investment capital. That is, opposition to Stalin's breakneck pace of industrialization, not to mention his increasingly heavy demands on the collective farms. Then Stalin announced a law that made death sentences mandatory for oilfield managers failing to meet their quotas. These big managing bosses in the party and the mass of de facto petty bourgeois, new class, government bureaucrats revolted. This incentive program could spread to them and was too much. Wrath of disgruntled bosses. Two mechanics of replacing Stalin at the Congress of Victors in 1934. The disgruntled bosses marshaled sufficient votes to name Sergei Kirov, the Leningrad party chief, to be Stalin's successor in the event that Stalin was to die or be recalled. 1. 2. In the official final count voting for party main secretaries, there were 4. Stalin got 1056 votes, and Kirov 1055 votes. This made Kirov the official successor. Stalin was first secretary and Kirov now second secretary of the 4 secretaries running the party executive. Stalin's title changed once again, and he was no longer the general secretary but now the first secretary. Stalin's official title with regard to leadership had changed several times in the early years of Bolshevik power, and of course he had been given other responsibilities and concomitant titles that went along with them, including Commissar for Raprin, Workers' and Farmers' Inspectorate, and Commissar for Nationalities. Then the Congress ordered Kirov from Leningrad to Moscow, where he would be the Moscow party boss. That would have put him right next to the seat of government and power in the Kremlin. 3. Kirov confided in Stalin about the meeting forced upon him the day before the actual voting by disgruntled regional party bosses who wanted him as their candidate. Kirov was perhaps Stalin's closest friend, and he offered to refuse the appointment, but Stalin would not hear of it. After all, with Kirov as his number 2 waiting in the wings, the disgruntled party bosses would really have nothing at all except a person with exactly the same views as Stalin, except a little, or a lot, more congenial. Perhaps more willing to listen and respond positively to well-thought-out arguments. What would be truly dangerous for Stalin was if some cream-puff Bolshevik, like Bukharin, were the candidate of the disgruntled. With a piece of shit like that, Stalin's words not mine, as number 2 his program and pace would be under constant and immediate threat. Better to have Kirov as number 2 whilst he figured out how to deal with the disgruntled bureaucrats. How it played out. Kirov continued his close friendship with the first secretary, Stalin's new, most important official title. Stalin urged Kirov to accept the appointment as second secretary and Moscow party boss. However, the party's most important regional bosses had succeeded in achieving one of their objectives, namely, Stalin was warned. He was not omnipotent, and the bureaucracy would not stand still for that kind of punishment, just for the radical and impossible speeds he was demanding in the industrialization of the nation. One-time Politburo luminary Nikolai Bukharin and associates were already plotting Stalin's assassination, as we have learned in subsequent years. Albeit pathetic incompetent planning that came to the immediate attention of Yagoda's Chaika. Kirov assassination disgruntled brought to heel in December 1934. In the event, it was Kirov who was assassinated before he could get to Moscow. Kirov had delayed his own transfer as long as possible, because he liked his Leningrad post and did not really want this job in Moscow at all. Stalin believed Zinoviev and his organization, which Kirov had replaced as party boss of Leningrad, to be responsible. However that may have been, Stalin used the assassination of his closest friend Sergei Kirov as the keystone to launch a series of internal purges of the state and government apparatus, and the party itself. A case has been made that Kirov's womanizing, including the wife of the local Chekist who shot him, may have been the real reason. Trotskyites have made it a matter for foreign consumption as another set and concrete lie, that Stalin engineered the assassination. As improbable as that would have been, who in the West knew any better? As Stalin saw it, eliminating his opponents in the party, government, and eventually state, Red Army, Navy, and police, was the only way to maintain the rate of industrialization. Stalin was convinced that socialism, as a stage, could still be reversed in the coming capitalist world war, if the USSR was not totally modernized, industrially, by that time. As you may have guessed, Stalin equated any person's opposition to the party Politburo and Central Committee plan and pace with such a person being a criminal counter-revolutionary. Subsequent trials centered on the accusation that Trotsky, Zinoviev, and other well-known long-time troublemakers had conspired with Hitler and the British and the French and nearly innumerable others in attempting to sabotage the pace of the 5-year plans in order to sabotage the Soviet Union under Stalin's leadership. The defendants linked to these plots in a variety of ways. Zinoviev and Kamenev were charged with organizing the Kirov assassination. They confessed at trial and were executed shortly after the beginning of the Civil War in Spain in 1936. The effect was that the disgruntled bosses had been brought to heel. Soon they and their supporters at the 1934 Congress of Victors would be gone. Soviet socialism continues encircled by imperialism. Meanwhile, in China, Mao Zedong had built a red base area in Kiangsi, Hunan, and had withstood 4 successive anti-red bandit campaigns of the fascist Chiang Kai-shek and his Nazi German and Imperial Japanese advisors and suppliers. In 1934, Mao had had to launch the long march of some 7,000 miles across all of South China, and then up China's western frontiers, swinging east to Yan'an in the northern mountains of Shenxi. It was a 2-year-long migration featuring this mobile army fighting on a daily basis. Eventually, the Chinese communists were in the right place for the coming struggle. Shenxi was part of the very heart of ancient China, and always had been. Furthermore, this put the Chinese communists on the frontier with Soviet Mongolia and the USSR. Given the plans of the Japanese capitalists to attack both the People's Republic of Mongolia and the Soviet Union, this was strategic gold. Japanese military forces could not deal with those two and leave their entire left flank open to attack. By the middle 1930s, the European capitalist classes in country after country had placed total police state regimes, called fascist, over the mass of workers and farmers. The European capitalist rulers were fully committed to fascism and to the destruction of their own native labor movement, and the red heartland of socialism in the USSR. They had begun by placing in power fascist regimes, such as that in Hungary after the defeat of Bolshevism's, Bela Kun's, first attempts in 1919 to establish a Bolshevik government, where Admiral Horthy became the first fascist leader. Then in Italy under the rabble-rousing, previously social democrat, Benito Mussolini, who had given the name fascist to his philosophy of the rich ruling the poor. Then came Portugal under Dr. Salazar. Then, in Spain, General Francisco Franco. Of course, in Germany, they appointed Adolf Hitler. All these men were committed to raising legal violence against workers as their first principal political program. Lesser fascist leaders took command. In places like Austria, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. In 1934, only France and the United Kingdom had not yet gone fascist. France soon would, 1940, with a little help from her friends in high places, e.g., the Duke of Windsor and the French Hitlerites. And in London the capitalists were relying on a succession of Tory, Conservative Party, governments to put a London-Berlin-Rome axis together. On the far right of Britain's Tory class were those, such as the Nazi Duke of Windsor. He would be on the general staff of the British Expeditionary Force in France, in 1940, and would engage in ultimate treason by providing all the information at his disposal to the Nazis. Then, the British capitalists figured that with or without their former king, they would be able to liquidate the labor movement in Great Britain and join with Hitler in a worldwide onslaught against Bolshevism. This was the policy of all of the Tory governments in the 1930s, but became shamefully obvious under Chamberlain as 1939 approached. Concession after concession was given to Hitler. He was allowed to take country after country. In 1938, Chamberlain betrayed Czechoslovakia, although Britain and France had a solemn collective security treaty with that country. Both the British and the French ruling classes refused to step up their war preparedness because they wanted to be sure that a clear and present signal was being sent to Hitler. Namely, that they were no threat to him. Hitler should just go right on building his military machine, go right on and attack the USSR. A task they were not up to, given the red sentiment in their own countries and, as Winston Churchill had pointed out in 1920, the Bolsheviks' ability to maintain massive standing armies indefinitely. On September 29, 1938, Chamberlain gave away Czechoslovakia to Hitler as the final green light to the Führer. On November 15, 1938, Stalin reacted by taking Comintern troops out of Spain 6 weeks later. The brigades held a farewell march through. The final jockeying for position between the USSR and its enemies, the UK, France, Italy, Germany and Japan, now began. It could only culminate in the World War II that Lenin and Stalin had been preparing for over nearly 2 decades. Stalin's spies' proletarian secret service. As you will recall, Lenin had placed Stalin in charge of both the Russian Party's Red Intelligence Service, the Cheka and Red Army G2, and that of the Comintern. One division of that Red Secret Service had to do with reporting on the machinations of the imperialist governments and ruling classes against the proletarian state and the worldwide working class movement. Here Stalin's spies gave more than yeoman service, they provided absolutely essential information in a reliable and continual way. Among those we know about, because of their public exposure, were 1. 2. The British Ring of Five, also known as the Cambridge Five, and after the 1960 appearance of the movie The Magnificent Seven, as the Magnificent Five, Harold Adrian Russell, Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald D. McLean, Anthony Blunt and John Cairncross, adding the American Michael Straight would make it the Ring of Six. But although Straight was recruited at Cambridge, he was immediately transferred to a U.S. controller, and therefore is not to be considered as part of our Cambridge group. Alexander Orloff via Arnold Deutsch recruited the first 4. Orloff took personal direct control of all of these 4 in February 1935. The Cheka ran these Cambridge Five. There was a separate British ring, run by Red Army G2, GRU, only 2 of which members are known, Sir Roger Hollis, eventual head of MI5. Hollis was recruited in China by Red Army G2 and Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor, another G2 China recruit. Hollis is the subject of Peter Wright's book Spycatcher. In 1940, the Stalin decided to take Anthony Blunt from the Cheka and to insert him inside MI5. That marks the first time that Chekists operated outside MI6 in Great Britain, where MI5 had been up and until then the exclusive territory for Red Army Intelligence, GRU. 3. 4. 5. 6, and still others were run by Stalin directly, such as, in Japan, Richard Sorg, embedded in the Nazi embassy in Tokyo. Otto Kuznanin, Molotov and Stalin originally recruited Sorg. In addition, the Industrial Intelligence Operation Red Orchestra in Germany and Switzerland created by Orloff. Steve Nelson and Associates in the USA, who ran the espionage program into the Manhattan Project for Beria. Each American has his own recruitment history. There were many more Soviet spies, many of this caliber, many still unknown. For example, in China, Richard Sorg relied upon Anna Louise Strong and Agnes Smedley, who worked for the GRU, but each of these women has a background story still clouded. At any rate, we will focus on the most famous English-speaking world agents, in England primarily, because England was our most deadly enemy, and eventually on the US spies involved in penetrating the Manhattan Project. These spies provided Stalin with the inside information as to what the British and American rulers were doing and plotting, and the Germans and Japanese. Consequently, Stalin was able to plan his military strategy knowing what all commanders dream of knowing. As I was taught in U.S. Army Intelligence Training School, Foote Holabird, Baltimore, Maryland, in 1960, and that is the intention and activity of one's friends as well as enemies. There was almost no anti-Soviet plotting by the British and Americans or the Germans and the Japanese that Stalin didn't know about all of the time, including their secret development of the atom bomb. That in itself is a tremendous accomplishment, and makes the Red Secret Service the most successful of all such entities that have ever existed. Read Kim Philby's book My Silent War, and Alexander Feklisov's book The Man Behind the Rosenbergs, and my book, The Buccaneer, for that matter, for some of the insight on intelligence activities of those days. Hitler pulled off successful surprise attack. One might ask, if all that is true, and it is, how is it that Hitler caught Stalin unawares on June 22, 1941? Especially since both the English and his own spies were warning him of the Nazi buildup and intent to attack. And the answer is, that Stalin had to make a judgment call and he made the wrong one. Instead of attacking first, he decided to move the bulk of his Western attack forces closer to the German frontier to make Hitler understand what the Red Army could do and continue to seize some strategic points in the meantime. The idea being that the Nazis would think twice about attacking first, and of critical importance to gain one more year for the production of T-34s and Sturmovix. This judgment call was an understandable one. The British and French ruling classes had been involved non-stop in trying to start a German-Soviet war. It was provocation of this intent, which had been keeping Stalin busy and his spies for a decade before the Nazi attack. The Brit-French conduct during the Spanish War had been aimed at putting the Russians in a position from which they could be denounced and subsequently attacked by the so-called democratic continental powers, France and England, in alliance with Germany and Italy. The British-French ruling class failure in that regard began to become apparent when Hitler switched his emphasis from Spain to first Austria and then Czechoslovakia. Meaning, as 1937 and the Spanish Civil War unfolded, Hitler's 1938 focus shifted to Germany's World War enemies, France and England, and perhaps not so much on Bolshevik Russia, i.e. Spain, where at that moment things were going badly for the fascists, thanks to Stalin's intervention. In June 1941, Stalin had no reason to trust the lifelong virulent anti-Bolshevik Winston Churchill. That old reactionary would have done anything to take the German pressure off of his back and certainly would have loved to see the Nazis switch their forces to an attack on the Soviet Union. And the Nazi build-up along Soviet frontiers coincided with other Nazi war-making in the Balkans and against Greece. Goods were still moving back and forth, as per the Rapallo Treaty, between the Soviet Union and Germany, some of which the Germans could not do without. Furthermore, and most importantly for Germany, to attack the Soviet Union would be suicidal. Stalin had limitless natural resources, limitless human reserves, and the most advanced armaments in the world on the eve of the German attack. The Red Army in August 1939 had just proved its power by destroying the Japanese attack in Mongolia. Stalin credited Hitler with too much intelligence to provoke such a war at that time, a war he could not win, certainly to provoke such a war while his war with the UK and its empire was far from finished. Stalin had to believe this based on the results of the Spanish War and the performance of German and Soviet tanks and aircraft, where Soviet arms were proven far superior. Hitler, on the other hand, felt if he didn't move now, in 1941, the Soviet superiority would be twice as great within a year or 3 times as great within 2 or 3 years. In which case, by the time Germany might win against the British, it would be an exhausted Germany emergent, one that would not have the ability to consider attacking the Soviet Union. Finally, Germany had failed in its program to develop an alternative source of oil. It had to have Soviet oil, or give up on its program of world conquest. This oil had been largely cut off by Stalin since 1936, and was just one more practical reason for destroying Bolshevism. This objective, of rolling back Bolshevism, was one the nincompoop in Berlin would not give up. And for practical political reasons he had to keep Germany's ruling capitalists behind him. That meant he could not appear to be changing his mind about liquidating Soviet Russia and its communist base in Germany. No, if he was going to do it, he had to take the chance that surprise and luck would do the job. And 1941 was the last year Hitler correctly reckoned that he would have a chance relying on those two factors. On the other hand, only a mentally unstable analyst could have reached the conclusion that a historical, and indeed epoch-making, choice, that at best could be 50-50, should be deduced. Even so, unbalanced in the end, Hitler got close enough to satisfy his sponsors, at least for the moment, 1941. But the point is, even though Stalin's intelligence service was warning him, Stalin still had to make the final judgment call, and his decision turned out wrong. So was FDR caught off guard at Pearl Harbor 6 months later. When you are in the receiving position, there is only so much you can do. No matter how much vigilance you practice, a well-set-up trick can work. As proved by Hitler in his assault on Bolshevism and by Hirohito in his assault on the USA, although, in the end, Stalin was right and Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union failed, and with its failure, Nazism was crushed. Stalin's boys, the Cheka, Federal Extraordinary Commission combating counter-revolution, sabotage, and speculation. As you might imagine, had you been running the biggest intelligence operation in history for some 50 years, 1903 until 1953, you would probably have a special place in your heart for some of your stars. Stalin certainly did. Among those who earned his everlasting affection, several are worth looking at closely for a moment, even in a handbook. Why? Because as case studies, these spies show us so much about ourselves, our movement, and the people drawn to it. As such, they constitute models for those of you who would like to make similar contributions to humanity's struggle to enter the era of freedom. That was what Frederick Engels called that period soon to begin, in the near future. In other words, with the stage of communism. Let us take a glimpse at several that entered the proletarian secret service after the establishment of the first workers' government and state in the history of nations. Within 6 weeks of the October 1917 seizure, Lenin and the then quite small, 7 members, Politburo authorized the creation of the All-Russian, Federal, Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution, Sabotage and Speculation, on December 20, 1917. Russian initials for this new body led to the use of the term Chaika for this and every subsequent Soviet intelligence department regardless of name. For example, members of the last of the Soviet intelligence agencies, the KGB, Russian initials for Committee for State Security, and perhaps the most famous, were still called Chekists. And still being paid on the 20th of the month, the day the Chaika was created in December 1917, during the Politburo meeting of that date as examined in detail above. Felix Dzerzhinsky, Latvian rifleman, first Chaika chief. On December 20, 1917, Lenin and the Politburo were acting on the recommendations of Joseph Stalin and Felix Dzerzhinsky. See Chapter 10 for the minutes of this formative meeting. Stalin was on the Politburo. Dzerzhinsky was not. At this time there were only 7 Politburo members, and all matters having to do with state security had been handed to Stalin by his colleagues because Lenin wanted it that way. Lenin wanted it that way because Stalin had been acting, when not incarcerated, as chief of all Bolshevik secret financial and other similar activities since 1903. Dzerzhinsky was born into a family of minor nobility in Poland September 11, 1877. He is often considered to have been of Jewish extraction, but the evidence suggests his family were ethnic Poles and Catholic, as was his successors as head of the Chaika Vyacheslav Menzinsky. At any rate, Dzerzhinsky had been incarcerated off and on most of his adult life for revolutionary organizing. He had been brutally treated, leaving permanent facial damage. After the failure of the 1905 revolution, he was in and out of revolutionary activity in Poland and the Baltic nations, and spent the war years in a prison in Moscow until released by the February 1917 revolution. Dzerzhinsky was burning with hatred for his oppressors and the class they served. He had the habit of wearing jackets with the sleeves cut short enough to show the scars of the manacles that had been on his wrists for many years. In April 1917 he joined with Lenin and the Bolsheviks upon Lenin's return to Petrograd, and in July 1917 was elevated to the Bolshevik Central Committee at the Stalin-organized Bolshevik Congress in Petrograd. By December 1917, Dzerzhinsky had recruited a special elite armed force made up of Latvian riflemen. They were to act as his agents in his work during the October 1917 seizure, and thereafter they were the first ever-present Praetorian Guard of the Bolshevik Revolution. The 40,000-man Latvian force was composed of 8 regiments, and they were bitter about the imperialist war and joined with the Bolsheviks in April 1917. Whenever Lenin needed loyal shock troops in combat, they turned the tide the Bolshevik way. These 2 men, Stalin and Dzerzhinsky, became the closest of friends. They saw eye to eye on the nature of the worldwide class struggle, and how to conduct it for the people's side. At any rate, as I say, Lenin had directed Stalin to prepare the report on the condition confronting the revolution in terms of security, and how to fight subversion from the enemies of the people. Stalin had done so, but turned the December 20, 1917 meeting over to Felix Dzerzhinsky, who he proposed to take command of the new Special Police Commission. The 2 of them were recommending this to Lenin, to 1. Protect the revolution's leaders, and 2. To guard the revolution itself. See Chapter 10 for the minutes of the Chaika's formative meeting. Lev Felbin was a young lawyer and scholar drafted into the Tsarist army, and when restrictions against Jews becoming officers were abolished, as a product of the February bourgeois revolution, Felbin was commissioned. He soon became a Bolshevik, and after the seizure had been recruited by Dzerzhinsky into the Latvian Riflemen Red Guards. Here he was at hand when it was decided someone had to try to subvert the Anglo-American invasion from within, in the area of Russia north of Petrograd. Dzerzhinsky and his friend Joseph Stalin decided on Felbin as one of the 2 to take charge of that area. Felbin was given a new name more in accord with the locality, and of course all Chekists would have secret identities anyway. Stalin picked the name Alexander M. Orlov for Felbin. Orlov and his comrade Maria Rodonslav fell in love, and the 2 were married and together for the rest of their lives. And what lives they were! These 2 were always at the forefront of the global class struggle. To make their long story too short, let me say that Orlov and Rodonslav succeeded in 1918 in bringing the Anglo-American forces at Murmansk into the orbit of Bolshevik sympathizers. Later Orlov became the leader of the secret military forces Stalin needed to protect his flanks on the ill-fated Polish-German European campaign of 1920. Afterwards Stalin made Orlov the top Chekist for all of Europe, and in that capacity Orlov, using Arnold Deutsch, recruited the first 4 of the British Ring of 5, Kim Philby, Donald MacLean, Guy Burgess, and John Cairncross. Along the way he supervised the recruitment of Michael Straight, an American at Cambridge, but Straight was immediately transferred to a U.S. controller. The Russian government admitted this in a book published there in 1993. Orlov had been the Soviet resident in charge in London from September 1934 to October 1935. He operated through Arnold Deutsch, the group leader for the Cambridge 5. Orlov took over control directly of Philby, McLean and Burgess in February of 1935 because he was concerned MI5 was closing in on Deutsch. This concern came because Red Army G2 agent Roger Hollis warned Stalin that Deutsch had come under MI5 suspicions as a Soviet agent in Great Britain. Specifically and correctly, as spycatcher author Peter Wright suspected, Sir Roger Hollis, MI5 chief in the 1950s and 1960s, was not recruited by Orlov but by Red Army G2, and in China not Europe. As I say, it was Hollis that warned Stalin of MI5 closing in on Deutsch. I learned about Hollis in June of 1961 from my KGB contact in London, Lady X, as described in my book The Buccaneer. I had my own go-around with Hollis as I also describe in that book. Subsequently, when U.S. Army CIC, counterintelligence, arrested me in Italy in December 1961, I garnered from their questioning that Hollis was their source of information. About not only me but also the Soviet attempts to protect Philby et.al. They beat the shit out of me for 3 days, but being not too bright they let a lot slip out. For the details of my rescue via Frank Church and the Kennedy brothers, see my book The Buccaneer. These are only a handful of the most famous of Soviet spies that I mention here. But the fact is that Orlov recruited thousands of men and women, especially in Germany, but also in Italy and France, where he served as the resident chief of intelligence operations for the Cheka's foreign department. At the foot of Carlos Prieto. It was not until 1962, however, that I discovered from one of my most highly placed sources in the International Red Secret Service, the Mexican communist, playwright and one-time Soviet agent, Carlos Prieto, what would become Orlov's greatest accomplishment. Namely, the penetration of the US government at many levels with one objective. No, not the atom bomb. Half of that job was handed to Steve Nelson *, one of 2 of Beria's top atom spy bosses, to run for the Cheka. Orlov had a more important task. What could be more important than the atom bomb, you may ask? I know I did. This atomic mission of Nelson's is what Steve Nelson originally told me about in Portland, Oregon, in 1963, when he was trying to recruit me, not knowing I had already joined up in more ways than as a member of the Klissa. The answer about Orlov's primary tasks appears complex in that it demonstrates the extreme sophistication of Stalin's personal intelligence expertise as well as that of his closest associate and fellow Politburo member Vyacheslav Molotov. Stalin confronted a situation in 1936 that led him to believe that the Rapallo arrangement with the capitalist world was about to give way, to be replaced by a new united onslaught of the European capitalist class against the USSR, and that he had to get ready for a simultaneous attack from Japan. In other words, all of the world's capitalist countries, except the USA, would be at war against the USSR and the People's Republic of Mongolia. A two-front war that could not be won. Despite the fantastic progress in Russian industrialization, the fact was that it would take longer than the 10 years Stalin had been talking about to get Russia sufficiently industrialized to win a gross national product world war II. Against either European bloc, not to mention against the United European bloc allied with Japan. Unless the United States were to join with Bolshevism. It was clear by this time, 1936, that Bolshevism was not going to seize power in the USA, at least not in the near future. Had that opportunity ever been present, the American communists had missed it, and were now relegated by history to pushing FDR and his New Deal to the left. So, how could the US be persuaded under a capitalist government to join with Russia against Europe and Japan? Stalin did not know, but he felt that the FDR government in the US was at least relatively neutral concerning the USSR. Might some set of circumstances emerge which put the US at war with Germany or Japan? Then an alliance could be made to happen. Especially Japan seemed possible. Brigadier General, demoted to Colonel, Billy Mitchell wasn't the only one who could see the obvious. A refreshing historical movie starring Gary Cooper as the court-martial of Billy Mitchell, an Otto Preminger blockbuster in 1955, predicted this. Hypothetically, the FDR administration might well ask Russia for its support. Then the practical basis for changing the nature of the Rapallo world from a Soviet-German alliance against the rest of the imperialist countries into a Soviet-American alliance against the rest of the imperialist countries would exist. Stalin did not know how this could be made to happen, but he knew if there was anyone in the Cheka who could influence US events in this direction, it was Alexander Orlov. Historic strategic decision accordingly, in January 1938, Stalin called Orlov back from Spain. There he was running 1. Cheka operations in support of the Soviet-allied Republican government against Spanish fascist chieftain Francisco Franco. 2. A second war against Trots. And 3. Overseeing the shipment of Spanish gold to Odessa. Now Stalin explained his new task. Making this fascinating story too short, let me sum it up by saying Orlov established an elaborate ruse and made his way to New York, along with his wife and daughter. This is not the place to go into further details of his mission. Many of the details are still considered highest state secrets in Putin's Russia. However, the ruse worked, and when many years later Orlov was discovered living in the US, he managed to fool his FBI interrogators, convincing them of his true, secret refugee status. In fact, they did not find him. He wrote a book claiming to be an enemy of Stalin, and upon its post-World War II 1953 initial partial publication, the FBI read it and got in touch. Stalin could not believe how incompetent these Americans were. Stalin said to Beria about the American FBI in 1952, "Apparently we are going to have Lev write a book. I cannot believe it. How these guys, US intelligence, survived the war is amazing. Anyway, Orlov did it once, so he can do it again." But that is another story for another book, except to say Stalin read Orlov's report on March 1, 1953, and the next day had his fatal stroke. Orlov went ahead as planned, presumably because Beria told him to do so, with a series of articles for Life magazine in May of 1953, which later became the core of the book he had cooked up with Stalin. Then Beria still entertained the idea he would become the next first secretary, and one imagines he might have wanted the same access to Ike that Stalin had to FDR when it was critically important. He could not know he was about to be replaced by a Khrushchev-led coup in a matter of only a few weeks. Since the truth of Orlov's 1938 mission may be exposed by the Russian leaders themselves, Putin, Medvedev et.al., it might as well be mentioned here that the reality Stalin spoke of was, as Molotov well knew, that Orlov's secret access to FDR had been crucially important in getting Harry Hopkins to Moscow in the critical months of 1941 and firming up US support. And there was a new reason by 1953 for Orlov to need the attention of the USA's newest high leader. Dwight D. Eisenhower had been elected in November 1952, and Stalin wanted to establish contact with the new American president in the same way he had with FDR. Stalin knew Eisenhower, and they had had good personal relations during World War II. Orlov had done it once, he could do it again. Orlov, you will recall, had established direct contact with FDR in a manner later to be used by Albert Einstein. Stalin's comment on U.S. intelligence acumen was simply a remark as to the efficiency of the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, which the Russians considered a joke. At any rate, that direct contact between a trusted emissary of one nation and the boss of another was and is an old and distinguished mechanism in the diplomatic corps of many nations over many centuries. So, of Stalin's boys, it was Lev Felbin, Alexander Orlov, who occupied one of the ventricles of what so many consider to be a rather cold heart. Stalin himself, by the way, felt that way about himself, at least he said after the death of his first wife. "With her passing, my heart turned cold." Inside the SS Richard Sorge. When it comes to being the boss's favorite pet, no one stood higher in Stalin's affection than the German Richard Sorge. Sorge began his adulthood as a soldier in the Kaiser's army, and was interned in a Russian POW camp. After the capitalist provisional government was established in February of 1917, Sorge made his way back to Germany, where he eventually joined the soon-to-be-formed German Communist Party, in the autumn and winter of 1918. There he became a member. When Comintern delegates met with representatives from two other would-be internationals at a conference April 2nd to 5th, 1922 in Berlin, Sorge acted as an armed bodyguard for several delegates, including Finnish Communist leader Otto Kuusinen. Kuusinen recommended Sorge to Chaika boss Felix Dzerzhinsky, and accordingly he was recruited. Kuusinen is the man who inspired me, by the way, to join the international communist movement when in June of 1961 a copy of his book, Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism, was personally given to me in London by the chiefs of the Communist Party of Great Britain, CPGB. At this time the Chaika's foreign operations were at Starovsky Square in Moscow, where Joseph Stalin had his main offices and secretariat. Here Stalin met Sorge for the first time, and the two men hit it off. Sorge had learned Russian while a Tsarist prisoner, and Stalin knew a little German from his years of working the oil fields of the Black and Caspian Seas. Sorge went on many foreign assignments for Stalin, but the one that changed the world was his mission to Japan. First, Stalin sent him to China, where he built an extensive network in Shanghai and as far north as Harbin. There he worked closely with two North American Comintern agents, Anna Louise Strong and Agnes Smedley. He also recruited several men who would be extremely useful to him and us in the future. Then Stalin sent him to Japan. In Japan, Sorge had a blank check as far as money was concerned. He used his Chinese and Korean espionage agents to build a radio system that would send clear, in the open, verbal communication, as well as code, for Sorge with Moscow Central, or directly to Molotov Stalin, from wherever he established his base in Tokyo. In the event, Sorge established his radio base near his office, which was in the Nazi embassy in the Japanese capital. Yes, by this time Sorge had become a lieutenant colonel in the SS intelligence service and been assigned to this nest of evil in the Nipponese capital. Sorge told Stalin that the summer 1939 attack of the Japanese on Mongolia was a test. The war with Russia faction was inside the Japanese general staff. There Sorge attended their meetings as a German observer at their request. That clique wanted to expand and seize Siberia for all of its potential and as a place to put their army of unemployed. The other half of the Japanese general staff wanted to attack south and seize all the colonies of the British, the Dutch, and the French. And along the way, expel the Americans from everywhere in Asia and the Pacific. Especially from China, which this faction wanted to take completely into the Japanese co-prosperity sphere. Sorg gave Stalin the detailed order of battle of the Japanese forces on the Mongolian frontier. Stalin saw immediately what Sorg had seen. That was the Japanese did not have modern equipment and depended on suicidal soldiers to accomplish their missions. Accordingly, Stalin sent General George Zhukov to take command of the most modern land and air machinery the Soviet Union had, including planes and tanks jerked right out of their design institutes and prototype production lines. These new tanks and planes had been perfected as a direct result of our intervention in Spain. They had been the best planes and tanks by far in Spain and had been further improved, immediately, in the USSR war plants in the years from 1937 to 1939. Shit kicking. When Zhukov attacked the Japanese, at the end of August 1939, at the Mongolian-China border formed by the Kokengioel River, he wiped out their entire 80,000-man infantry in the Japanese Expeditionary Spearhead, destroyed what armor they had, and virtually their entire committed air force. It was a turkey shoot, as Soviet soldiers took on the Japanese 2-1, with flanking waves of the most modern tanks in the world supported by the world's first fighter-bomber close-air support warplanes. Zhukov employed the new Soviet tactic called deep operations or deep battle. Actually, as you will see in Chapter 13, Soviet pilots had flown prototypes of these fighter bombers in Spain, to the extreme distress of the Phalangists, Franco's fascist party, forces attacking Madrid in November 1936, and thereafter, they dominated the air in 1938, they turned the tide again and again in land and air warfare in Spain. To give you an idea of desert warfare in those days, think of a tank, T-28s and T-34s, with a heavy cannon capable of accuracy at several miles against a supposedly armored Japanese target. The Jap tank, unknowing therefore it was being targeted, and in any case unable to do anything but run. Before it could turn and run, repeatedly Soviet tanks blasted all Japanese tanks and mobile artillery to smithereens. Soviet ground attack fighter bombers, the first Sturmovix, finished off those further away. In the meantime, charging Soviet infantry took on the men of the Japanese spearhead hand to hand. Russians are a lot bigger than Japanese. These men took the Japanese apart like a surgeon gone mad. The Mongolian landscape stank of decaying flesh. For the better part of the year, 1939, was an otherwise bad year for us, but now had turned terribly wonderful. Japan had assembled another 1,000,000 men to follow their spearhead into Siberia. However, when their spearhead was liquidated, 80,000 men dead and their armor destroyed, they sat dumb. The Imperial General Staff back in Tokyo was shocked and permanently resolved not to get involved again in Soviet territory. Instead, they decided to move south against the Europeans and the Americans. This made Pearl Harbor inevitable. Stalin's boys had done it again. Zhukov and the Red Army men and women. Richard Sorg inside the SS and Jap General Staff. All were of our greatest generation. Preparing for Nazi attack, delicate balancing act as 1940 and 1941 unfolded, Stalin arranged his Western forces quietly. Too early obvious preparation for defense against a broad attack might well trigger that attack, even earlier than it was already planned. Too little preparation, and the USSR would not be able to go over to a counter-strike or a preventive attack of its own on Germany. For example, deploying troops and aircraft to the western frontier would be provocative as seen from the Nazi side. Yet, failure to do so would make assault against Nazi Germany a too lengthy process to get underway when the time came. And what if the Germans were to attack in the meantime? Would it be better to have occupied forward positions or deep defensive positions? These were difficult questions, and the only certain defense against a German miscalculation was total secrecy on Red Army deployments. Yet certain deployments had to be obvious if the bordering client countries, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Finland and the Baltic nations, of the UK, France and Germany were to be properly cowed. As we have seen, Stalin wanted to wait one more year, before this inevitable war began, or perhaps two, if possible, so he could keep building the Red Army in both men and material, and jockey as best he could to prevent a unified capitalist onslaught. In 1 year he would have an additional 10,000 T-34s and perhaps that many Sturmovix. More than enough to smash a Nazi attack, or even a London-Berlin-Rome Axis attack. Second World War begins. Sorg does it again. 2 years later, Sorg warned Stalin the Germans were going to attack on June 22, 1941, at 6 a.m. WST, West Soviet time. Nevertheless, this time Stalin chose not to believe it. He convinced himself that his own SS misinformation bosses had taken in Sorg. Of course, Sorg was right, and thus rose in Stalin's esteem. Accordingly, when Sorg next told him the Japanese had rejected Germany's demand that they enter the war against Russia, Stalin paid attention. The anti-Comintern Pact Germany, Italy, Spain and Japan had signed required all to come to the aid of any one of them involved in war with the other capitalist countries, but primarily the Soviet Union as indicated by the name. Now he began preparing to shift George Zhukov and his troops from Mongolia and Siberia to the Soviet West. Consequently, Zhukov smashed the Nazis at Moscow in December 1941, dealing Hitler his first massive defeat of World War II. Shortly after this final transmission, where he spoke directly with his close friend Joseph Stalin, Sorg was uncovered by the Japanese secret police. Jailed, tortured and executed, the boss's favorite spy passed into the pantheon of Soviet heroes. To this day, Sorg's Japanese grave is the contemporary site of an annual pilgrimage of many communists wishing to pay respect to the boss's favorite. Respect we should pay today. Michael Borodin, Chicago to China. Some of Stalin's boys had been with him in the very early years. One was Michael Borodin. After the defeat of the 1905 revolution, Borodin, a member of the Bolshevik Party, had fled Russia for the United States. Along the way he met another person, a young Bolshevik woman, and she became his wife and accomplice in Chicago, where they both went to work teaching school and trying to help working people. The capitalist provisional government had been established after the February 1917 revolution in Russia. Then within 6 months his own Bolshevik party turned the revolution socialist. As the Bolsheviks seized power in early November 1917, on the U.S. calendar, Borodin made his way back to Moscow. There he renewed his personal friendship with Joseph Stalin, met with Lenin, and following Lenin's advice joined the Cheka's Foreign Operations Department. Borodin went on several missions including Mexico and the United Kingdom. In Britain he accomplished much and made his mentors proud. So proud that they sprung him from jail in London and gave him a new assignment: China. Borodin arrived in Canton, Guangzhou, China in December 1923 on a tramp steamer with 200 dead sheep killed in a hurricane typhoon. The Brits were looking for him after the jailbreak in London, and he could not venture anywhere near Hong Kong on his way up the Pearl River, thus the tramp steamer. If his arrival lacked a certain dignity, that was soon remedied when the rest of his team arrived a few weeks later, for Stalin had sent several thousand Soviet advisors and nearly 50 ships full of small arms, tanks and airplanes. Why? Lenin had argued for and gotten unanimity in the Politburo for a policy of intervening in China to support the creation of a progressive capitalist government under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen. In charge of military operations for Sun Yat-sen was General Bleicher, a hero general of the Red Army in the Civil War and now Lenin's hand-picked chief of Soviet-Chinese military operations in China. We have already reviewed this topic in depth in Chapter 11. Kim Philby. Finally, as a case study is Harold Adrian Russell, Kim Philby. Kim Philby was the son of a rather famous, in his own right, British iconoclast Harry Bridger St. John Philby, Orientalist and Arabianist, who would become the closest personal advisor to Ibn Saud, king of what is now Saudi Arabia. His descendants still rule. St. John Philby engineered the U.S. entrance into Saudi Arabia, cutting out his British compatriots. The Saud family that rules today owes virtually everything they have to him. But it was St. John's son the world would come to know best. Alexander Orlov, Lev Feldman, recruited Kim Philby, via Arnold Deutsch, and 3 more of the rest of the British Ring of Five, where he was the resident spy in charge from September 1934 to October 1935 and took personal control of Philby et al. In February 1935. Orlov subsequently guided Kim through the maze of Spain in 1936, 1937, heading for a career in MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service. It took some 6 years to get him this far because Kim had rather carelessly let it be known far and wide that he had communist sympathies in the late 20s and early 30s, so this had to be covered up. Once inside MI6, Kim rose rapidly because he did such great work. By this I mean the work of killing German agents, largely conducted by Stalin's Chekists who were helping him accomplish his assignments in Iberia, German agents in Spain and Portugal being shot down like flies. Eventually Kim became chief of anti-Soviet and anti-communist operations for all of MI6. Along the way he became a member of the XX-20 committee, so named because these 2 letters together look like a double cross. This referred to the British breaking of the German military code via the machine codenamed Enigma, and the subsequent formation by Anglo-American Canadian intelligence of the project called Ultra. All this data was transmitted to Molotov forthwith. Kim found out about the atom bomb almost immediately, and that meant of course Stalin found out immediately. Even more importantly, as a member of the 20XX double cross committee, Philby acquired all of the information he needed to give directly to the boss about Enigma, the machine that broke the German military code. By the Brits and how they did it, which is to say, how the machine worked. After the war, Kim was recommended by M to become the next C, but since one time MI6 agent Ian Fleming made the letter famous as the code name for the MI6 chief. I have used it. Then U.S. President Harry Truman asked that Philby be sent to Washington to guide the American former OSS agents, at their request, in setting up the U.S. equivalent to MI6, that is, the CIA. As a matter of interest, M is referred to properly as C in the pre-Bond Graham Greene book and Alec Guinness movie. Our Man in Havana. Kim turned down the offer to become M because he said, "It was more important to help the Americans get into the fight against communism." Kim was in at the beginning and throughout the formation of the CIA and supervised some of its earliest attempts to overthrow Soviet power. The most famous of these being his sabotage of the CIA campaign against communist Albania. Anyway, this story has a long way to go, but I think you get the idea. The gringos certainly did and spent the next 20 years trying to find moles left behind by Philby without, as far as I know, success. These are just a handful of the agents who were close to Joseph Stalin. If it is true you can judge a person by the friends he keeps, then our judgment about Stalin should reflect these associations with heroes of our cause. Theory and method: Soviet spy recruiting. As if Stalin did not have enough on his plate at home in the period after 1926, there had been a series of embarrassing Soviet espionage exposes in Western Europe. Some of them had come home to the boss himself, if for no other reason than that Joseph V. Stalin had accepted the working title of the boss, if only by not rejecting it. In 1930, Stalin asked his favorite spy protege Lev Felbin to come up with some surefire way of preventing this stupid stumbling from happening ever again. Lev Felbin, Alexander Orlov, suggested to his close friend and sponsor at the Chaika's highest level, Joseph Stalin, that problems with 1. His foreign agents having been uncovered and subsequently tied to him, and 2. Problems in the quality of the information being received, could both be resolved by making a wholesale change in recruiting policy. Orlov took responsibility for the then current mess in European high-level espionage operations because he was the one who had invented the approach of recruiting industrial espionage agents from the working classes, albeit often engineer-level trained workers. Such men and women were simply not fit for duty of the kind required of persons working as assistants to ministers, for example. They made mistakes due to their class backgrounds that quickly made them suspect to the secret counterintelligence police agencies of the advanced capitalist countries. Even when they were not at fault, their class backgrounds brought them under suspicion first. I will let Orlov tell the story in his own words. This officer, Arnold Deutsch, ed., took account of the fact that in capitalistic countries lucrative appointments and quick promotion are usually standard to young men who belong to the upper class, especially to the sons of political leaders, high government officials, influential members of parliaments, etc. To them promotion is almost automatic, and it does not surprise anyone if a young man of this background, fresh from college, passes the civil service examinations with the greatest of ease and is suddenly appointed private secretary to a cabinet member and in a few short years assistant to a member of the government. Accordingly, in the early 1930s, the NKVD residentiaries concentrated their energy on the recruitment of young men of influential families. The political climate of that period was very favorable for such an undertaking, and the young generation was receptive to the libertarian theories and to the sublime ideas of making the world safe from the menace of fascism and of abolishing the exploitation of man by man. This was the main theme on which NKVD residentiaries based their appeal to young men who were tired of a tedious life in the stifling atmosphere of their privileged class. And when the young men reached the stage when their thinking made them ripe for joining the Communist Party, they were told that they would be much more useful to the movement if they stayed away from the party, concealed their political views, and entered the revolutionary underground. The idea of joining a secret society held a strong appeal for the young people who dreamed of a better world and of heroic deeds. Orlov, 1963:108-109. Orlov was a genius, as Stalin had recognized many years earlier, and in no single area of expertise than that of selecting his chief captains did he excel more. In charge of recruiting the scions of the British ruling class, he appointed Arnold Deutsch. Orlov traveled to London as chief resident spy for the Chaika in 1934, and in that capacity oversaw Deutsch's work firsthand. In February 1935, after being warned by Stalin that Deutsch was under MI5 surveillance, Orlov took direct command of Philby, Burgess, and McLean. 2 more paragraphs from Orlov's 1963 book, Handbook of Intelligence and Guerrilla Warfare, 1963, Alexander Orlov, The University of Michigan Press, Ann Arbor, 187 pages, illustrate one of Arnold's main recruiting methods. A very important part in influencing the young men was played by idealistic young women of various nationalities who already had a smattering of Marxian theory and who had acted as a powerful stimulus which spurred the young converts to action. Having been brought up first by governesses as sissies and later sent to exclusive private schools, they were charmed by the daring Amazons, and their intellectual association with them often blossomed into romances which frequently culminated in marriages. These young men hardly regarded themselves as spies or intelligence agents. They did not want anything for themselves, least of all money. What they wanted was a purpose in life, and it seemed to them they had found it. By their mental makeup and outlook they remind one of the young Russian Decembrists of the past century, and they brought into the Soviet intelligence the true fervor of new converts and the idealism which their intelligence chiefs had lost long ago. The NKVD intelligence no longer worried about attaining promotions for their charges. The promotions came automatically, and the NKVD chiefs looked forward to seeing some of the new recruits in ambassadorial posts a few years hence. Orlov, 1963:109. Thus Felbin, Orlov, had again persevered and having taken a severe problem off the boss's plate, and in hand, resolved it perfectly. John Cairncross, later known within Chika circles as a ladies' man type, liked to say that a woman would always prefer 10% of an outstanding man to 90% of a mediocre man. This was his paraphrasing of George Bernard Shaw's take on these matters. I suspect he saw himself as belonging to the outstanding man category. At any rate, I see this statement as a logical corollary to Deutsch's Amazon recruiting axiom, at least for the heterosexual two, Kim Philby and John Cairncross, and the bisexual one, Donald MacLean, of the Cambridge Five. Guy Burgess and Anthony Blunt, being homosexual, were beyond Deutsch's Amazon reach and were approached in a different way. Interestingly, the notorious womanizer, Kim Philby, was known by the codename Son or Sonny, and Guy Burgess as Little Girl, reflecting, if nothing else, Deutsch's and Orlov's attitude toward their sexuality. Another person of the Amazon type utilized by Stalin was Wallis Simpson. She was recruited in China by Red Army GRU, G2 in this book, ed., along with Roger Hollis, who later in MI5 warned Stalin about MI5 surveillance of Arnold Deutsch. In China, Wallis Simpson was a high-class prostitute recruited via the good offices of Anna Louise Strong. Simpson went on, as we all know, to be the paramour and in fact wife to David the Prince of Wales, King Edward VIII, and later the Duke of Windsor. David Windsor was noted by Winston Churchill in one of his memoirs as an example of the sad travails of being a royal in Britain. Along the way, Churchill mentions having seen David, while in the early charge of Wallis Simpson, naked after bath, and that he was, to paraphrase, completely shaven from neck to toe, like a newborn baby, including his genitalia. One can imagine the Amazon Simpson babying her lover and then fucking him to death in those ways. Only an experienced courtesan of her sort can. Wallis Simpson not simply acquired a laundry list of men as lovers and husbands before she met the prince, but had survived in the tough world of Shanghai prostitution, where one would have to be very competent just to maintain one's head above water. She made short work of David and forever after had him under her Amazonian spell. Trotskyists and other imperialist historians can't get over being able to describe Orlov's 1938 departure for New York as a defection, despite the exposes now common knowledge such as provided in this book. I remind the reader that had Orlov really defected, he would have given up Philby et al. Sometime after his establishment of USA residence in 1938. He never did. Not even as late as 1953 in his Life magazine articles, when both Philby and Blunt, not to mention Cairncross and Strait, were deep undercover. Philby was being daily examined in London as he was under suspicion for the Burgess-MacLean defection. Philby was cleared within 3 years by Foreign Minister and future PM Harold Macmillan in November 1955 in the House of Commons. Not in his subsequent book based on the Life magazine articles, and not in his 1963 book when Philby had already escaped to Moscow. In fact, Orlov, who died in 1973, never did give up anybody. What kind of defection was that? The truth is that the Orlov articles and book were part of a plot cooked up by the boss and his favorite spy, Felbin, Orlov, to re-establish contact with the new U.S. presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower as they had with FDR in 1939. On March 1, 1953, Stalin read Orlov's first report on his progress in that regard, and the next day, March 2, Stalin had his fatal stroke. Orlov went ahead with the Life articles and later book, presumably because Beria, his controller from 1938 on, told him to continue with publication. At that point, Beria thought he would be the next first secretary. He could not have known Nikita S. Khrushchev was plotting a coup that would replace him within weeks. Beria must have wanted to have the same sub-rosa contact with Ike that Stalin had had with FDR. What is a ladies' man? Well, if we set aside the psychopaths who prey upon women for evil purposes, my experience has taught me that what we are usually looking at is a man who prefers the company of women to men. And a man who is fascinated by a beautiful woman's sexuality, anatomy, with a liberal interpretation of the word beautiful. Such men want to spend as much time as possible with a given woman. Usually numerous women according to travel and life experiences, as a sailor might have in every port, so to speak. And when the womanizer in question is with that special woman, he is extremely attentive, kind and polite, solicitous and romantic, and most especially after these qualities, exciting. Many women, including beautiful women, have never, or rarely, had that kind of attention, and they appreciate it, and respond in kind. Some of them have been mistreated by men, or at least disappointed, and so they are especially appreciative. For this reason, the genre, ladies' man, does not die out as female liberation proceeds apace. Orlov could have thought of himself and the role his life's love Maria Rodonslav played in keeping him in the forefront of the Chaika. He might also have thought of his protege Marcus Wolf, the eventual lifelong head of the GDR's, East Germany's, Foreign Intelligence Service, who was likewise infatuated with his life's love Emmy Stenzer. Both women were of the Amazon type and both got their arms, early on, around the very kind of men the Chaika needed more than any other, at least in those years. For more on this, read Wolf's autobiography Memoirs of a Spy Master, 1998, Pimlico Random House UK, London, 367 pages. However, these are other stories for elsewhere. For now, let us turn back to the new breed of spies being recruited in the decades of the 1930s. These new highest-order spies were giving Stalin the kind of information of critical importance to him in defeating the Stanley Baldwin, Neville Chamberlain conspiracy against world socialism. Those spies came to be known as the Cambridge Five, or after the appearance of the movie The Magnificent Seven in 1960. The Magnificent Five. As we have seen, Red Army G2 had its own network operating inside Great Britain. But the network that became best known to the world first was that established by Alexander Orlov, Lev Feldman, in Great Britain. His chief recruiter was the PhD, chemistry, Austrian Jew, Arnold Deutsch. Stalin had given Orlov command of West European intelligence operations after 1922 precisely because its focus was on industrial espionage, and it was Orlov who had developed the plan. You will recall in this book you learn how Stalin intended to defeat the capitalist plot to strangle the Soviet Union via a trade embargo by lifting all of their scientific and engineering secrets. The way in which Orlov instrumentalized his program was simply to follow the flow of young technically minded youth into science. Especially the engineering programs established by the capitalist classes in their universities and vocational technical schools in Italy, Austria, Germany, France, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. The eventual prototype of all of these private programs was the one used then and now by Schlumberger. For those of you with an interest, I advise studying how Schlumberger recruits, trains, and deploys their engineering graduates, and you will have the entire story in its best form. Everyone else, e.g., Halliburton, Dresser, Baker Hughes, is just a piss-poor duplication, of varying quality, none of it worth a great deal. As Schlumberger expanded with its Soviet base, Orlov used that company to introduce even more of his industrial espionage agents. To see how NL Industries tried to duplicate Schlumberger's program, see my book Third Crusade in the series Idaho Smith Search for the www.amazon.com Foundation, Book 6, available at Kindle Books. www.amazon.com. Interestingly, the most important Sionist of today's Schlumberger family is the actress Léa Seydoux, star of the most recent James Bond epic film Spectre and the forthcoming Bond 25. Léa Seydoux was born in 1985 in Paris, France, to capitalist Henri Seydoux. Her grandfather, Valéry Schlumberger, Jerome Seydoux. Schlumberger and Seydoux is chairman of PATH, and her father is a great-grandson of businessman and inventor Marcel Schlumberger. Eventually, Orlov had thousands of controlling agents running well over 100,000 engineering experts in private concerns all over Western Europe. Along the way, it was natural he would encounter a few of exceptional quality and ability. One of these was the 24-year-old University of Vienna PhD, chemistry, graduate Arnold Deutsch. Deutsch came on board about 1924, and therefore was careful from the get-go about not letting his communist sympathies appear in public. In fact, he claimed to be an observant Jew. Accordingly, he was always the perfect man to send anywhere in the capitalist academic regime of whatever European country. Furthermore, in Austria he made a reputation in his undergraduate and then graduate years as a person interested in Freudian psychology and sexual politics. A kind of enlightened sexual freedom movement mixed with birth control advice for blue-collar worker of both sexes. The Austrian vice squad police took notice of him in this regard, but never for an instant for what he was. An extremely dangerous Comintern and Chaika recruiter of industrial spies. Orlov's industrial espionage. In 1932, Orlov sent Deutsch to France, where he built a series of short-wave radio broadcasting ships to be used to relay industrial espionage information in large quantities directly to Moscow. Orlov personally established secret frontier crossing points for carrying truckloads of engineering documents across the French border from Germany to ships waiting in Holland and Belgium. And the many thousands of lower-level Soviet spies in Germany and Italy were producing huge volumes of paper traffic that could no longer be transmitted by wireless, as the documents were now so vast in volume. This bulk required a rapid expansion of the Translation Bureau in Moscow. Stalin eventually had to move out of his Staraya Street upper floor to make room for all the new personnel and their equipment. Furthermore, this bulk of paper required sorting by order of magnitude importance that required hundreds of new technical specialists who then directed each set of documents to the ultimate end users. Staraya Street in its entirety could not accommodate everything, and the entire operation was shifted to a new multi-block complex on the outskirts of the capital. Stalin eventually got his office floor back. Orlov assigned political espionage in Britain in 1933. Stalin gave Orlov command of an entirely new operation centered on Great Britain. This time it had nothing to do with industrial espionage, for that was already well handled thanks to his Continental Industrial Espionage Operation. This time Stalin wanted Orlov to penetrate the most dangerous of all the capitalist regimes in Europe. That of the Baldwin gang that was planning to send Germany against the Soviet Union as soon as they possibly could. Stanley Baldwin was the head of the British Conservative, Tory, party from 1923 until 1937 and Prime Minister of the UK 3 times during that period. His understudy was Neville Chamberlain, who finally succeeded him after 1937 on a permanent basis. At least until the Hitlerites launched an all-out attack in 1940 and Chamberlain was finally replaced, along with the Brit pro-fascist foreign policy, once and for all, by Winston Churchill. In 1933, however, this was all in the future, and a temporary glitch had developed in the Brit capitalist plan, that glitch being Hitler's unexpected ascent to power January 30, 1933. The majority of Britain's ruling class was terrified of another Cromwell, and they saw Hitler as exactly that. For the moment Stalin had a breathing space, and he intended on using it to get an inside accurate view of how the Baldwin plot was unfolding as the coming years themselves advanced. Accordingly, in 1933 Orlov appointed his best man, Arnold Deutsch, to take control of high-level political espionage in Great Britain. Step 1 was the recruitment of Kim Philby in Vienna in 1933. Deutsch sent his first agent Edith Siskitsky to London from Vienna in January of 1934. Arnold Deutsch, himself, arrived in London in early April 1934. Orlov would not be able to follow to London until July of 1934, but by that time Edith had recruited her new husband Alex Tudor Hart, and had cleared the way for the recruitment of Kim Philby into MI6. The Baldwin gang had been sandbagged and did not even know it. Edith's Vienna communist girlfriend Litzy Friedman had married the already committed communist Kim Philby in Vienna in 1933, and the two of them arrived in London in May of 1934. Litzy was also one of Deutsch's agents, and she prepared Kim to meet her boss. That meeting occurred in London in July 1934. Kim talks about that meeting with Arnold Deutsch in his autobiography My Silent War, and reams have been written about it ever since Kim's January 1963 defection. For a cinematic view of the drama, see the Sharon Stone 2004 movie A Different Loyalty. And with regard to biographies of Kim, let me save you time in sorting through the many books about him by recommending the book I consider the best biography of Kim Philby yet published by the Cap Press, The Philby Files, Jenrick Borovic, 1994, Little Brown, New York, 382 pp. Kim introduced Arnold Deutsch to Donald Maclean in August of 1934, and in December, Maclean introduced Deutsch to Guy Burgess. Thus the first three of the Magnificent Five, Philby, Maclean and Burgess, were on board with the Chayka by the end of 1934. Also, in the Season 2's last episode of Sean Bean's Legends, a new take on Philby's ongoing 1972 work for the Chayka is explored, on Netflix in 2017. In December 1934 Roger Hollis, a Red Army G2 agent in MI5, warned Stalin that Deutsch had just come under MI5 surveillance. Stalin warned Orlov, who immediately, February 1935, replaced Deutsch with himself. The Chayka operatives had barely escaped detection, but they had escaped, and now their primary mission of penetrating the highest echelons of the Brit ruling oligarchy would get underway. Note that had the later defection of Orlov to the US been real, he could have made millions giving away these three, not to mention all the others, but he never did give away anyone. The date of Roger Hollis' entry into MI5 is important because the contemporary Brit government places it later in the 1930s for its own reasons. The truth is that spycatcher author Peter Wright was on the right track when he traced Hollis to recruitment by Soviet Red Army intelligence in China in the 1920s and his entry into MI6 not long thereafter. Exactly when Hollis went into MI5 is still a state secret in Putin's Russia and obfuscated in the United Kingdom. Chapman Pincher, in his book Treachery, most recent revised edition published in 2011, claims Richard Sorg recruited Hollis in China for the GRU around 1930 to 1931. What I do know is that Hollis was in MI5 in 1934, and that he warned Stalin, that December, that Arnold Deutsch had just come under surveillance as a possible Soviet agent in England. Penetration. Donald Maclean. It was Donald Maclean, son of Liberal government education minister Sir Donald Maclean, that first ran the gauntlet of his own communist past, and successfully so. He admitted his youthful Marxism at his interview in August of 1935, 1 full year after his recruitment into Cheka foreign operations. Confronted with the record of his university communism, under British communists and Cheka agents James Klugman and John Cornford *, at Cambridge, Maclean confessed. He stated that he had not altogether thrown his left sympathies off. The examiners were in turn sympathetic and wanted this brilliant young scholar who had aced the examinations. Maclean passed the interview and immediately entered the foreign diplomatic service. Here he had direct access to the inner portals of power and real policy concerning Germany and the USSR. John Cornford went to Spain to fight with independent Marxists from England but soon joined the Thalmann battalion of mainly German communists. He was killed by the fascists at Lopera, the Córdoba front, on December 28, 1936. His death led 2 weeks later to the Cheka recruiting of the American Michael Straight. James Klugman, whose sister married Maurice Cornforth, a longtime communist theoretician, joined the CPGB in 1933, acted as a recruiter for the Cheka at Cambridge, and became a famous communist writer.